If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment for more videos like this.
People who are convinced they've seen something paranormal or an unknown demon. What's your story, and what do you think you actually saw?
When I was a baby, we lived in a very old, creaky house. My mum was half convinced that it was haunted, as small things, toys, medicines, and pieces of jewelry kept going missing. Sometimes she swore that I was interacting with thin air. She thought that perhaps it was a mischievous child ghost. One night, my mum put me to bed. She gave me a blanket and a pacifier and left the room once I was asleep. An hour went by, and I was awake and crying. She came in to soothe me and found that my pacifier was missing. She thought I spat it out or flung it out of the cot. She searched the room, pulled the cot apart, shook out all my blankets, checked my clothes, and could not find the pacifier. Mum, probably sleep deprived, decided she was going to scold the ghost. She put me back in my cot, left the room, closed the door, and in her best mum voice said sternly, "That is enough. You give that back right now." She waited a few moments, and I stopped crying. Mum came to check on me again. My pacifier was back in my mouth. A few years ago, my friend and I were walking up Young Street to meet another friend at a nail salon. As we walked past a coffee shop with a big window looking in, I saw, in a quick glance, something that terrified me. A thing was sitting in a booth and was the only person in the cafe. It was like a skinny man but with a top hat, and his jaw was coming out the side of its face with bulging eyes. Something felt really wrong about seeing it, like I shouldn't have seen that thing sitting in the booth like a regular patron. It was so shocking I doubted what I saw and kept walking. About 30 seconds later I asked my friend if he saw something in the cafe we passed. He proceeded to describe the exact same thing and mentioned he was too scared to go back and make sure his eyes didn't deceive him. We both just kept walking. Mine was an encounter in which my oldest son was slapped by an entity that appeared in his room. In a nutshell, we lived in a Victorian mansion in PA, where there had been a prior house fire that killed a young mother and her baby. He told me that a cradle had appeared, and a baby started to cry from it. He went to comfort the baby, and Mama showed up, slapping him for his efforts. I thought he was dreaming, but there was a handprint on his face. He told me a lady in purple had done it. A few nights later, I was walking to my bedroom, and as I looked down the hall, there was a woman in a purple Victorian dress standing in it who turned and walked through a wall. That made me want to know more about the afterlife. Walked home from school as a teen, and I climbed into my window because my brother was being a tool and wouldn't open the door. Once inside, I walked to the kitchen to get food, per usual. I yelled up the stairs to see if he wanted anything. He yelled back no. I could hear his footsteps above me. He kept trying to mess with me through the grate on the ceiling above me as I ate at the kitchen table. He acted like he wanted to play hide and seek, so I obliged. I walked all over our house looking for him. I opened cabinets and closets in search of him. I could hear him laughing. I was getting frustrated that I couldn't find him. I yelled up the stairs, telling him that I was getting frustrated. I called my grandma to see if she knew where my mom was. She said, "She and your brother are sitting right here." My stomach fell through my bottom, and I said, "Someone come get me right now." I went outside and sat on the sidewalk stairs until someone else was home. This was just the beginning of what we experienced, but it made me a believer. Here is my true ghost story. In the late 1990s we were living in a small older ranch home on a 5-acre parcel in Tualatin, Oregon, in what is known as an urban growth boundary, meaning it was left undeveloped so all of our neighbors had anywhere between 1 to 10 acres of land. This area is also known for being near the end of the Oregon Trail. So my oldest son was about 3 years old at the time, and I would often hear him talking in his bedroom when he was supposedly napping, so I poked in one day and asked who he was talking to, and he pointed and told me, the old lady who was sitting in the rocking chair. He did have a rocking chair in his room, a place where we would read together, but of course I didn't see anyone in it. Well, wouldn't you know, a couple of nights later, when my then husband was out of town, I was awoken to the weirdest feeling I've ever experienced. It was dark, and my bedroom felt so heavy and uncomfortable, like the air had a heaviness as though being underwater, and I looked up and was face to face with an older woman, dressed head to toe in pioneer garb, and she was just staring down at me. We absolutely locked eyes, and weirdly I felt as though she was as shocked to see me as I was with her. I jumped up out of bed and flipped on the lights to see nothing, but down the hallway I heard a series of creaky footsteps on the hardwood floors going directly to my son's room, so I ran down and opened the door to check on him, but he was just peacefully sleeping, and I thought, oh my god, I just saw the old lady. I once saw my dad's doppelganger when I was up late one morning doing schoolwork at home. For context, I was pulling an all-nighter for class, and I was on my computer in the middle of the night when my dad supposedly went out of their room and went to the window and took a smoke. He usually does this sometimes when he's had trouble sleeping, and take note, their room, the living room where I was using the computer, and the dining room are on one floor separated by a bar area where I can still see him walk by and head towards the window area in the dining room. So fast forward, I was done and got sleepy, so I turned off the PC and checked if my dad was still smoking. When I got up and checked, he wasn't there, and when I went to check if my dad was inside the room, there it was. I saw my dad sleeping, and the entire time I was still doing my stuff for school on the computer. I didn't see him pass by going back because I can clearly see if someone passed by to my right in my peripheral vision, and it sent shivers down. Hey, spine didn't once pass by the entire night going back to their room. So I ran to my bed and hid under the blanket because that was the scariest shit I've ever experienced. Later that same year, my dad passed away. That was the only time I found out that seeing someone's doppelganger is a bad sign that that person is going to pass away soon. My grandmother's place. Goddamn, this place was just freaky. It felt kind of scary to be there, and I lived there for a few years in the basement type area by myself. This place had everything, and it was in the middle of the ducking woods. I moved in at 14, and for the first few months, I would wake up between 3 to 4 a.m. with knocking on the back door. It escalated to my full first name being called in my mom's voice from the back door, plus the knocking. For context, my mother didn't live in the country, and no one outside my family knew my full first name. That stopped, but then the bedroom I was in started to feel really weird. At night it was like the bed sunk down in the right side corner, like someone was sitting down. It freaked me out, but I would just keep my eyes shut and go to sleep. And then, I was on the phone with a friend in my bedroom, and she asked me who was screaming. No one was screaming. I left the bedroom, and immediately she said the screaming was gone. So I migrated to sleeping on the couch. And of course the TV eventually starts flipping on and off. Woo! And then there was drumming in the middle of the woods in the middle of the day. 2 of my dogs went missing. I would adopt one, they would go missing, adopt another, he also disappeared, so I stopped adopting dogs. While I had my second dog, he would sit on the bottom of the stairs, and his fur would actually move like someone was petting him. Freakiest shit ever. Then there was the weird deer figure in the long gravel driveway that my friend and I saw when I was 17, that the headlights went straight through. And the time I moved back in for a few days when I was 19, and that night the moving chains in the back of the truck I borrowed actually rattled so loud my friend and I could hear it from the living room. The next day there were scratches on the side of the truck from the chain inside of it that we did not use for the move. And of course, I visited my grandmother there once, then stayed the night at a friend's house, and we were about to go to sleep when I got this feeling of just absolute dread? Terror? Death? I don't know. Opened my eyes, there was some round floating concentration of just blackness floating there. I ask if my friend can see anything weird, she sees the same thing. We rushed out of there so damn fast. Just so much shit there, honestly. Never experienced anything like it after moving out. The place has been sold now. Wish the new owners the best. I was using a Ouija board with 2 of my close friends when we connected to a woman from the 1800s who was in a Native American tribe. We talked for about 30 minutes. Before saying goodbye to her, we asked her if she had anything to tell us. She gave us a random set of numbers and letters, which we wrote down. After saying goodbye, we decided to look the number and letter combination up. Google took us to a painting of a Native American woman and her daughter from the 1800s. The description of the painting had the same combination of letters and numbers she had given us. The woman who we talked to also said she had children. None of us have researched Native Americans outside of school, and the painting was an obscure one, too. I had always believed in spirits, but I wasn't 100% sure of their existence until that encounter. It was wild. This story is from my childhood. My sister, 16, and I, along with our cousin brother, 15, and cousin sister, 22, moved into our house after their father passed away in a horrific accident. So at night, one by one, we heard a woman's ankle bracelet voice at night, not on a daily basis, and each day a different person. We were very convinced that something was wrong in that room. The backyard was just one house away from a graveyard. We all were scared of these experiences. We all decided to talk to my parents. As typically Indian parents, they ignored us and told us we were seeing too many movies, so we felt that way. We stopped sleeping in that room because we all know that that soul would come in at night around our door and just won't let us sleep. Then one day when my grandfather and grandmother came to visit us, they slept in that room, and then the next day they asked Dad which kid came in the night into their room. Dad said that it was locked from the outside, and nobody had the key to enter that room. My grandfather lowered his voice and said that there is something very wrong about that room. Somebody at night came and pulled his blanket at brutal force, and when he woke up, nobody was near him, and some voices that he heard at night. My dad said, "We know that there is something wrong about that," in a lower voice. "We might have to do puja, the Indian way to organize a holy event, in that room." They were talking while they thought I was asleep, but I wasn't, and to this day I have never told any of my siblings. I've got a couple of other stories if somebody is interested. DM me, because there are 2 more instances with me that convinced me about souls, and honestly, I swear I have been through this. Yes, but it wasn't really a ghost. We don't know what it was. Ever since this happened, my beliefs about the paranormal have been upended. A friend and I were having a walk late at night, and as we were walking past some parked cars, one with an open door had someone inside of it beckoning us to come over. Neither of us saw who it was, we just saw a car with an open door. As we approached, neither of us remembers if she got out of the car or where she came from. A tall blonde girl with shorts was standing near the car telling us to come over. Her hair was tied up into a ponytail. She must have been about 5 feet 10 inches. But when we would have been standing face to face with her, she was simply no longer the same person. We don't remember how or what happened, but instead we were talking to a girl who was very short, skinny, and scraggly. Her hair was a darker brown/gray and was very wispy, like she was balding and had only strands left. She was telling us that she had just run from the police and wanted to know if we had tinfoil so she could do heroin. At first we went with it and said, "No, we don't," and "Wow, you ran from the police, that's wild," etc. Then I suddenly felt a feeling of dread and grabbed my friend and said, "We need to get away from this person right now." It felt like if we stayed, something terrible was going to happen to us, like it was a trap of some sort. Basically, it seemed like we encountered some sort of shapeshifter, because there was no blonde girl, nobody in the car, and just this really weird witch-like woman standing before us, filling me with negative vibes. We didn't even talk about it until later in the night when my friend said, "Don't you think it was weird how that girl looked like a tall blonde girl but then she wasn't when we were talking to her?" Her saying that to me blew my ducking mind, because I didn't know if she saw quite the same thing I did. I thought I must have been mistaken somehow. We then talked about it for a long time, not knowing what to make of it. I lived in a house where I'm convinced I was hearing/seeing the ghost of the previous owner. When I was young, my family and I would move around a lot due to my dad's job. I saw a lot of towns and cities along the way, and frankly, I enjoyed it. I was around 7 or 8 when we moved to this certain house. I can't remember the town's name, but it was a small town with nothing around but a Walmart. Enough about the background. This house was rustic looking. Not very updated. There was always this vibe about this house, like you weren't alone and everyone felt it despite trying to deny it. The first time I heard anything was once when I got home from school. I was the first one home, so I decided to play a video game. I was really into the game until I heard a creaking noise. Like when something is leaning back and forth in the wind. I could hear it coming from the dining room. I put my ear up to the dining room door, and I'm certain the noise was coming from there. I open the door, and the noise stops, and I hear a huge thump. I feel a huge cold draft come out of the room. I tried to figure out what the noise was but never figured it out. That same night, I fell asleep in the living room and again was woken up to the creaking noise. I ignore it, but for some reason I get this feeling of dread and look towards the hallway and can see the silhouette of someone in the prone position on the floor. I thought it was my brother trying to scare me, so I turned back and started to fall asleep until I heard a quiet voice call my name. I immediately feel dread and pull the covers over my head. I start to hear footsteps coming towards me and stop immediately above me. I'm literally about to shit bricks in my head. I tell myself to start swinging. I didn't care who was standing there. I do just that, and nobody is there. I go to sleep in my mom's room and keep it to myself. The curiosity was killing me, so I asked one of the neighbors who has lived in the neighborhood for a while if he knew anything. This certain neighbor was an older man. He was usually a jokester and was always laughing and joking. As soon as I asked, his face turned serious. He asked me why I was asking so fast. Apparently the previous owner killed herself. Apparently she hung herself from the dining room chandelier. I swear I never felt chills like that before. I am convinced I was hearing her body rock back and forth, and that big thud was when the chandelier gave out. The only reason I say that is because the chandelier is no longer there. I'm also convinced she called my name. Do you believe in demons? Let me start by putting this out there. By no means am I trying to convince you of what I saw, but I wanted to share this experience I had recently, and this seemed like the best place to do it. It was 3 nights ago, and I had just gotten off of work at around 3 a.m. I worked 10-hour shifts, so naturally I was exhausted, but having gotten so used to my schedule, I was still quite alert and present. I lived next to my grandparents, but since my cupboard usually stays bare and we're out in the middle of nowhere, they're kind enough to leave a door unlocked for me when I get home so I can grab something to eat before heading off to bed. During the night in question, I came home like usual and quietly slipped in through the back door to make my way to the pantry. My grandfather has a terrible habit of sleeping on the couch in the den, so I had to be sure to stay extra quiet as to not disturb him. As I'm passing through the den, I happened to glance in his direction, and when I did, it took a moment to register what I was seeing, and then all I could do was scream. There, in the dim glow of the television screen, sat a small, winged creature propped up on one of the arms of the couch, sitting in my grandfather's direction. Its body was hunched, tucked almost into the fetal position, but it was sitting straight up, hands resting on its knees. I froze solid and simply stared at the thing. It looked somewhat like your typical depiction of a demon or devil, but its body was a solid black. Not hairy or cast in shadow, but a solid pitch black. Offsetting its skin color were two longish, oval-like eyes and a set of perfectly straight teeth, both a piercing white. I didn't notice any horns. As to be expected, its teeth came down to small points, and its little ears on either side of its head came up like spokes. Almost unconsciously, the bag I carried to work slid off of my shoulder and hit the ground at my feet. The thing and I sat in silence, and it seemed to regard me for a moment before putting a bony finger up to its lipless mouth and making a shh gesture. I could feel my mouth quivering as I stared at this little thing, but I wouldn't have much longer to stare. The glow of the TV flickered as a jump cut happened in whatever was on, and in that brief moment of darkness, the thing was gone. Just like that, it had disappeared. There was no indication it had ever been there or even an indentation where it sat, and I spent a solid half hour looking for anything to prove what I just saw was real. I've never suffered any serious hallucinations or anything like that, and it felt just as real as anything else that has ever happened to me. I slept in my grandparents' spare bedroom that night, admittedly too afraid to be alone in my own house. They didn't mind the next day, but I sort of half-heartedly explained I was too tired to go out to my own house instead of telling the truth. I'm really scared for my grandfather's life, or my own for that matter. I don't know if this was some creature intent on delivering an ominous warning or if it just felt like goofing around. I really don't know. I always loved listening to scary ghost stories but never had anything happen. However, in college in the 1990s, during my freshman year, our RA's boyfriend invited several people over to his farm. We're just hanging out, telling stories, no alcohol, no drugs, when he starts in on the story of his moving a lot as a kid. One house they lived in the late 70s, was old. Close to 100 years old or more, and on the banks of the Mississippi River. It was him, his dad, and mom living there. There was something in the house, and it didn't like his mom. Things of hers would go missing. She'd bang her head on doors and shelves that would suddenly get pulled out when she would bend over and stand up. One day, he and his dad went to the store. His mom decided to take a bath. The only bathroom with a bath in the house was upstairs. How you got there was up the staircase, and technically the bathroom was straight ahead, but you couldn't get through the wall there. The only way in was to go right or left, and through a bedroom and back into the bathroom, of which both the bedrooms share behind that wall. It's a tub bath, no shower. She gets in, and right after she gets in, both bathroom doors slam shut. Maybe it's a breeze? Who knows, but the thing is both bathroom doors open inwards. She pops out of the bath and tries to open a door. It's locked. You need to open them with those old school skeleton keys, and she doesn't have one. The other door is locked also. She starts pounding on the doors, but her husband and son are still gone. She tries repeatedly to open the doors, but it isn't until they return that both doors just suddenly unlock without a key. They moved out shortly after that. At this point, the RA's boyfriend stops recanting his story. I'm in disbelief, so is my roommate, who is also there. He then goes and rummages up a stack of photos. Now, this is the mid-90s for this telling. Photoshop isn't a thing, and the photos he pulled out were date-stamped from the 70s. He showed us all these pictures of the living room in that house. Tons of orbs, which we don't know what those are, back then, at least. But a couple of photos show this wispy white figure, and it looks female in a dress. I tell you, my goosebumps had goosebumps looking at these photos. I might not have believed his story, but these photos told another one. The wispy figure and orbs were always around his dad. In more current days, I had one kind of insignificant incident in my own home last year, but that could have been a major coincidence. My grandfather had just passed in the week or so prior. My husband and I were home watching Kindred Spirits. Adam Berry is saying out loud in the episode, "If you are here with us, turn on that flashlight." Right then, across my living room, my battery-operated makeup mirror went on. My husband and I froze. It has never done that before. It's been a year since and it still hasn't. However, for current-day ghost shenanigans, my good friend's house is totally haunted. Multiple people have heard and seen the ghosts there. Definitely 2 males and recently, a female. My friend and I are always talking about the latest incidents. There is one part of her house that gives us the creeps. It's this bookcase. It doesn't even look creepy. I mentioned this to her recently, and she said weird noises happen near that bookcase all the time, and she says she gets the chills near it. Our new theory is that it's a portal, and that is why it bothers us. She hears her name get called, and no one is there when she looks. She has seen a younger man go into their office and an older man in her bedroom at night. I work in real estate, so I have access to land records, so I did a search. 2 former owners passed away while owning that home. The day I did research on who lived there and gave her the info, that afternoon she came home from work, and there was mail for both of the former deceased owners, who hadn't lived there in over 20 years. I'm a skeptical believer. I'm going to go down a list of things to disprove something before I conclude paranormal. But I absolutely believe there is something, some layer, that we do not understand. A few days after my mother had passed away, I was at the park with my boyfriend at the time and my mom's little dog. I had just let the little guy off leash to go for his run when out of nowhere I had this overwhelming feeling of being enveloped by the most absolute, pure love and comfort. It felt like my mom was all around me, difficult to explain, but almost like when you hug someone and you just feel them and their energy surrounding you. I felt completely at peace and had this resounding feeling that everything would be alright. I rationalized my experience by telling myself it was just my grief over missing my mom so much and went about my day as usual without telling anyone, other than my partner, who was with me at the time and didn't share my experience. The next day I was at home with my older brother, the previous day's events completely forgotten by now. We were hanging out in his room when, of course, the topic of Mom came up. This is gonna sound crazy, but I had the weirdest thing happen yesterday afternoon. Out of nowhere, I just felt completely at peace and like she was here with me. Just about mid-sentence. Mid-sentence, that's not crazy, I had the exact same thing happen to me yesterday too. It turns out that we both experienced our mother's love and comfort at precisely the same moment. To this day I don't have a rational explanation for it. My brother and I hadn't spoken to each other at all the day it happened, and the following day was the first time we sat down to chat. I like to think it was our mom coming to say one last goodbye and let us know we were going to be okay. This happened when I was 5 years old. Just to make things easier for me since English isn't my first language, I want you to imagine a big, spacious room in 2D, so basically a big rectangle. At the top right-hand corner, my mom and aunt were washing the dishes, and at the lower left side corner, I was playing in the mini Jeep, their backs facing me. This day in particular, I sat in the trunk of the car, facing the steering wheel, couldn't drive around, it wasn't charged, nothing behind me, my hands clasping the bar that served as the driver's and passenger's backrest. I was extremely bored, so I began to rock back and forth, increasing the intensity and speed each time. As I gained momentum, I had the most absurd thought: what would happen if I let go? So I did. I let go. I immediately regretted letting go. I was falling, and by the way I was falling, I knew I'd end up falling headfirst. I closed my eyes thinking, no, I regret this, waiting for the pain. Instead, what I felt were 2 big, strong hands cupping the entire back of my skull. This is hard to explain even in my first language, but basically my head was supposed to come in contact with the floor first, but those 2 broad, strong hands prevented my head from touching the floor, then my back. I didn't feel anything touching my back, but it felt as if my body levitated a few centimeters from the floor. The first part of my body that actually touched the floor was my feet, and it was in a very gentle manner. When my feet touched the floor, I felt as if I was being lovingly tucked in. There's no other way to describe it. My back slowly touched the floor, and then my head. I could literally feel the hands moving away. By the time the hands let go, I was already able to lift up my head on my own, so it never even touched the floor. I looked back at my mom and aunt running towards me crying, thinking I broke my skull or something. They didn't see anything. Even though I saw them run towards me, I asked, who did it? Who cupped my head? They were pretty much speechless and confused. To this day none of us can come up with an answer. I remember asking my grandma that same day who possibly could have saved me like that, and she said that it must have been my guardian angel. That I don't know and can't prove it, so I don't know if guardian angels really exist. I just know it happened. This has solidified my belief that there are many unknowns in the world. I was always fascinated by the paranormal but never completely convinced and always found a rational explanation. During my late teens to early 20s, 2008 to 2010, I lived in a large Victorian house with a few friends while we studied. What started as feelings of being watched or negative vibes in certain areas of the house progressed to disembodied voices, objects moving or thrown, multiple people being hit while sleeping, full-bodied apparitions seen by housemates and guests, and even an unexplained house fire at 4 a.m. that didn't trigger the smoke alarms as a house full slept. Also, the two different guys that lived in the loft conversion room on separate occasions both went from outgoing and upbeat people to unsociable and hostile, isolating themselves from the rest of the household. Sometimes it was a nuisance, other times it was straight up terrifying. The weirdest thing is that after nearly a decade since leaving that house, I have a strong desire to go back there, despite having settled at the opposite end of the country for the last 5 years. My first ever paranormal experience. So I attended the last Halloween tour at a place called the Ulster American Folk Park in Northern Ireland. There was a new story told of a recently recovered chest full of documents, stories, last wills, and testaments, etc., of this man, Crudden Boyle, a man who worshipped Belay, the Irish god of death. I do want to mention that this was a Halloween tour. I am a skeptic, so I'm not convinced that it's ghosts, just that the experiences I had definitely didn't seem part of the experience, since no attention was brought to them. The folk park has some buildings that they painstakingly moved brick by brick from their original location, including a building called the Campbell House, which is considered to be the most haunted building in the park. The folk park discovered that Boyle had lived in this house for about 5 years, engaging in blood rituals and incantations. When we were let into this house, we found a multi-pack of beer and some coffee cups from some teens looking for a cheap thrill, which apparently links into the house having an increased rate of break-ins after Crudden left. So, this security guard claims his grandmother was a Boyle, so potentially related to Crudden. Just before the guard entered the building, I heard a singular knock upstairs, and as he spoke and mentioned the rituals and magics that Crudden was involved in, I heard 3 distinct thuds throughout. I was also standing in front of a small indoor window. I kept looking at it, it was behind me. I constantly felt like there was something watching, like if I kept checking, I might see a face, but I could have been psyching myself out. The final thing that confused me is that no matter how many times I heard his name, I struggled to remember it until I heard it again. That continued until after I left, but this being the day after, I remember his name just fine. Like I said, I'm a skeptic, so I'm not convinced that it was paranormal. We never went upstairs on the tour, so there could well have been someone upstairs, but it didn't seem like there was. Still, definitely really interesting. I'm a nurse. A few years ago I worked in the private sector. I used to smoke, so nearing the end of my shift, I went out for a cigarette. The unit next door had a corridor that connected to the unit I worked on. Security was always in place with keypad-activated codes for every external door. It was a corridor that was used daily by staff, however, patients were rarely transported this way. The corridor was over the smoking area, and you could always hear staff that were using the corridor. As it was the end of the shift, there was no reason for staff to have still been using the corridor. I say smoking, and all of a sudden, I felt this change in the general vibe, like there was static in the air. I heard the shuffling of feet like that of a patient, however, they weren't knocking on the doors or evidently distressed or acting like someone who had accidentally gotten out. Then this voice said, "Hello." I thought someone had escaped and maybe got confused. I took a member of staff with me, and we searched the entire 2 sites, everywhere, top to bottom, for someone who may have gone missing. No one was missing. Staff were telling me there is no way that a patient could have gotten access to this corridor. My family's personal paranormal experience. In 1995 in Fruitland Park, Florida, my parents lived in a double-wide trailer. Their trailer, however, was no ordinary one. Within a couple of months of moving in, they began to notice strange happenings. Most strongly in my brother's bedroom, that would soon be my bedroom as well, as my mother was currently pregnant with me. Toys would move on their own, Hot Wheels especially would just suddenly dart as if they were pushed with some serious force, the closet door would open and slam shut on its own, just generally odd things. Nothing malicious at first, so they just ignored the things and carried on with life. Skip forward a few months, one night my father was awakened with what he says is the most force he's ever felt pushing against his chest. He opened his eyes and said he saw something small, no more than maybe 3 feet, sitting on his chest. He has never been able to give a detailed description, but I chalked it up to being startled awake. He immediately began to scream, at which point my mother began to wake up. He says the thing jumped off his chest, ran across the dresser beside their bed, and darted out of the bedroom. My parents were in no financial position to just move, and my mother still wasn't sure that my father didn't just have a very vivid nightmare, as she didn't directly see whatever he did. Skip forward maybe a month, it would have been June or July-ish at this point, as I was born in August, and my mother was very pregnant with me at this point. My father went to work very early before the sun rose. My mother would stay in bed for a couple more hours as she ran a daycare from home. She says she was sleeping when she was awakened by feeling something touching her leg. She opened her eyes and looked towards the foot of the bed and saw something small, same as my father. She describes it as almost garden gnome-like, except much, much more malevolent. She closed her eyes and began to pray, asking God and Jesus to protect her. Whatever was there, she suddenly couldn't feel touching her leg anymore, and when she opened her eyes, nothing was in the room with her anymore. They continued to have malicious events, such as a toy car bigger than a Hot Wheels flying off my brother's TV and hitting my mother as she walked into his room. She swears it couldn't have been him, as he was on the other side of the room on his bed playing Nintendo. He corroborates her account, saying he saw the toy go flying and turned to look as it hit my mother. Skip forward again to August 14th, my mother began to go into labor with me, and at 6:21 a.m. on August 15, 1995, I was born. They never experienced any more malicious activity after my birth. The slamming of the closet door and other such events continued in mine and my brother's room and my sister's room that was right beside ours. We continued to live there until shortly before my 5th birthday, so I can still remember our closet door randomly slamming shut and scaring the crap out of me and such things, but nothing malicious. We moved and never experienced such things again, but none of us will ever forget it, especially the rest of my family. We continued to go by and look at the place several times over the following years as it fell into worse and worse condition. Not sure if it's still there or not, I would assume not, but who knows. My parents truly believed there was an evil presence there until I was born. She also experienced very odd things when she was pregnant with my sister, including a woman who started speaking in tongues and then told her the devil was after her and my sister. I don't know what to do with that, but yeah. It was all very crazy for me as a very young child to hear and see firsthand the things that would go on there. I will certainly never forget that place. I want to assure you that everything I've just told you is 100% true, no detail is fabricated. I've heard the same accounts my whole life from every member of my family, plus, as I said, I experienced some things firsthand. Bixler Lake, Kendallville, Indiana. I lived in a small town in Indiana called Kendallville, a branch town of Fort Wayne. I grew up there, and I was born in that small town. One evening, my uncle and I decided to go for a bike ride. Kendallville had lots of trails and lots of scenery, just an old small town vibe. There is this lake next to the high school, and it is kind of off to the side next to all of the houses in the town. During the bike ride, my uncle and I decided to go behind the library, which then veered off directly into the lake. There was a street and some sidewalk, and we decided to stop at a lamppost seeing that the moon was full over the trees. Thinking it would be a beautiful picture, my uncle told me to take one of the moon and the trees over the water. While I was taking the picture, the most grueling, hellsent gurgle/growl made me and my uncle jump, and for the first time in my life, I heard a 6 feet 3 inches giant scream louder than anything before. As I turn around, I notice the noise came from the back of the library, in between a couple of trees on a downward slope behind it. Did you hear that too? He quickly got back on his bike, and his eyes were almost bulging out of his head. As I try to find the source, I see this gray mist slowly glide in between the trees on the hill behind the library, and faster than anything I've ever seen before, it flew out to the lake. There were no animals, and it was late, there were no people out. I turned around and asked my uncle if he had seen the same thing, and he agreed, and we quickly sped out of there on our bikes. Recently I found out the library used to be a hospital when the town was first established and settled on back in the 1800s. I've also heard since then of a lot of drownings and accidents that happened in that body of water. To this day, neither of us has seen anything else paranormal, and my uncle, who was quite set in his ways, believes in spirits and the afterlife after the experience we shared, and I'm still extremely curious as to what we ran into that night. If you are curious, look up Bixler Lake, Kendallville, and you can see the library and the road, and it will help with the imagery. Sorry for my lack of storytelling skills. I hope it was interesting, as even to this day I still have a lump in my throat from the energy I felt and the noise we heard. I always fascinated by the paranormal, and my grandfather would tell stories from his childhood. They lived in a haunted house a few hours north of where we all live now. Moving on, in my later high school years, we were always looking for a haunted place to check out. Most of what we would check out were local legends. There's an old cemetery about 20 minutes from my house that we'd go to. I always brought a camcorder and a small digital camera. My first experiences at the cemetery were a few EVPs. My camcorder had a little LED light on the front, but it just wasn't enough to get a good video clip in complete darkness. We went back a few more times, and each time we did, it seemed like we got more activity. The next time we went out there, we just had a light snowfall. We were the first ones to enter the old cemetery since the snowfall and didn't notice anything unusual. We get to the back left side and hear something running. I aim the camera down and point out shoe prints that start by the gravestone in front of us and lead directly to a tree. I aimed the camera at the tree, and we caught a very dim apparition of a young female in a white dress, like a wedding dress. You can just barely see the breast line due to the poor video quality. We then heard what sounded like a young man yell, "Hey!" We looked over there and didn't see anything. That was enough for one night. We headed out. We eventually came back again, same equipment, just a few years later. We got a few pictures of an unexplained mist by a tree, an orb on a headstone, not a reflection. There's a young girl's face just above the orb that we can't explain, and a video clip of this same woman in the white dress. This time, I aimed the camera up and got a very clear image of her. In the video, she seems very tall. I'm 5 feet 9 inches, she had to be 6 feet 5 inches -7. We didn't see her firsthand, just in the video. Going forward, again, I went back with a friend. He went and did his thing, taking pictures and whatnot, and I stayed on the other end of the cemetery and recorded video. At one point, I got a glimpse of a young male figure, wearing brown trousers and a white/black striped shirt. He looked like he was straight out of the early 1900s. We haven't been back lately, but we're planning a trip out there in the next few months. Hopefully we can get some more video. I have a new camcorder with some bright LED lights and an IR night vision camera with some accessory IR lights. Another one was at a haunted road about 30 minutes from my house. There have been local legends that a murder took place out there, which were confirmed. There are also rumors that a witch lived in the woods and practiced witchcraft out there. I was never able to confirm the part about the witch, but I know for a fact that satanic practices took place out there. So this happened a few years ago. Prior to this, I had been out there a few times and never had anything happen. It's just a sketchy looking woods. Well, I went out there with a group of friends, and we took 2 separate cars. We parked on the side of the road, and I got out of my car and went up to his car full of people. They refused to get out and were warning me that something evil was out there. Well, I didn't listen. I kept trying to get them to get out of the car because of how skeptical I was. Finally, one of the guys gets out of the car, and we walk down the road a bit. We're standing there, I'm taking pictures in the woods, and we both heard this incredibly loud bird screech. We both froze for a second and booked it back to the cars and left. My girlfriend went out there a few months later, and her younger brother's friend saw a little girl crouching in the woods. He was so scared, he wouldn't get out of the car, which wasn't like him. I've never seen the little girl out there in all of the times I've been out there, but I've had a few different people claim to see it. The last few times we went out there late at night, we all got this feeling that we were being stared at. It's as if there are people lined up and down the entire road, and they're all staring at you, but you can't see them. It's almost as if you're being hunted. She can see him. We've all heard that children and animals can see things that we can't. They're more sensitive to the paranormal/supernatural side of things. I didn't really believe this at first. Until my own kids were born. They've all had their own experiences, but this one is about my youngest daughter. I will call her Bella. My father-in-law was one of those people who begged for grandchildren. Every family get-together it was always, "When are you all going to give me grandbabies?" Well, it happened, and he was a phenomenal grandfather. He was never too worn out to play, no mess was too big, and he never said no. But life happened, and sadly he passed from a heart attack. My girls were 2 years old, and Bella was just 8 months old. It shattered us. Even me, because he'd been in my life since I was 14. He was a second dad to me. It hit my 2-year-old pretty hard, but Bella, I thought, was too young to understand obviously. Fast forward to Bella being a little over a year old. Every time I'd hold her, she'd look off into corners, walls where nothing was, and smile, wave, etc. I just thought she was being a baby doing weird things. But then she learned to talk. This is where it gets eerie. I'd hear her talking to herself when her sister would be nowhere around. I listened for one day and heard, "I know you miss Rowdy Pawpaw. But Nana is taking care of him." Rowdy was his pet Shih Tzu. I walked in to ask her who she was talking to. She replied, "Pawpaw Troy. He misses Rowdy." "Oh," and he said, "Tell Nana happy anniversary." I knew she was trying to say anniversary because their anniversary was the next day. My mouth dropped. She didn't know that. She was too little. Over the years, Bella would talk about him working in the coal mines, the machines he worked on, his friends, and their families. Things she was not told about. Then another big incident where we all were freaked out. He wore a set of dog tags that he never took off. When my mother-in-law boxed up all his stuff, she misplaced it. She was so distraught over it. She babysat my girls for one day and called me crying. Bella found his tags. I was confused. She explained that she was walking my girls around outside, and her wedding rings on her fingers started to feel like they were burning or tingling. She ignored this, but Bella said, "Pawpaw is trying to tell you his tags fell into the vent in your bedroom." She went inside to look, and there they were. Bella is 6 now, and she barely remembers these things. But I think it's safe to say that she could see her pawpaw. A family friend had a vacation house down on Cape Cod. They always told stories about how haunted the place was, and we always dismissed it as ghost stories and nothing more. I was between 14 and 16 at the time my family rented the home, and we invited my entire family from Minnesota. Mom's side of the family, the first night there we had a few small incidents. The television turned on by itself constantly, and it would just be static. Things fell off the shelves by themselves, stuff like that. We simply ignored it as a faulty television and uneven shelves and didn't pay much mind. This went on casually for the next few nights, and I began to get a weird feeling I was being watched. So the layout of the house was 2 floors, and the second floor was a staircase that led to a landing. On each side of the landing was a bedroom where the younger cousins slept, boys on one side, girls on the other. I was the oldest, and the youngest was 4. So one night I'm awake, and I suddenly hear running up and down the stairs. Someone would run full sprint down and immediately turn around and run back up. This goes on for 5 to 10 minutes, and now I'm thinking, go the duck to bed, so I get up, and I open the door to see what is going on, and there is nobody there. I'm freaked out, but I tell myself, maybe one of my cousins sleepwalks, and no one told me. I live in Mass and rarely see my family in Minnesota, so it made sense. I close the door and lay back down. As soon as I lay down, the running starts again, but this time it sounds like it's running on the second floor landing. This goes on for a few moments before I can hear the footsteps sound like they are starting in the girls' room, and I can hear them getting closer and closer to my door. It got to the point where the footsteps were so close I expected the door to fly open when suddenly the footsteps passed through the door without opening, ran past me, and ran out of the exterior wall and continued onto the roof. I was, of course, hiding under my covers at this point. I managed to fall asleep telling myself that I was making it all up. When I woke in the morning, my cell phone was on a chair, and that chair had been perfectly dragged under a skylight. The skylight was open. It had rained after I went to bed, and my cell phone sat perfectly in a giant puddle on the chair. I know that skylight was closed when I went to bed, and my phone was next to me, not out in the middle of the floor. So I go to breakfast, and it's very quiet. We talk about what we are going to do for the day and all that shit when suddenly someone mentions hearing footsteps and running last night. It was like the moment in a horror film when the people realize that they are being haunted. We all agreed it was only a few days left of the trip and that we just needed to be respectful of the spirits, and perhaps they would leave us alone. In order to get to the basement, you have to go outside and enter the bulkhead. There is a washer and dryer in the basement that my aunt wanted to use so she could pack clean clothes and skip laundry when she got back to Minnesota. So she starts the load, and we go to the beach. Around noon we head back to the house for lunch. As we get there, my aunt goes down into the basement to switch the clothes to the dryer. Suddenly we hear a blood-curdling scream, and we all rush downstairs to see what's wrong. All of her clothes had been taken out of the washer and had been thrown into the dirt in a violent fashion. She was borderline in shock. We instantly knew it was the ghost trying to scare us into leaving. What in the hell is haunting me? I remember one night I was with my mom, and we were home alone. We were listening to Chills narrate stories when we had gotten kind of bored. We wanted to experience what was happening in the stories, and I suggested an EVP app and went around taking pictures. Oh, I was an idiot suggesting that. It was my worst mistake. Anyway, we finished recording and definitely see orbs flying around in a video, and one in particular stayed in the camera like it wanted to be noticed. After we observed the videos, which was nothing too much, we went to the photographs. We saw a cloud of mist by the doorway, which explained my not being able to push it open after taking the dog out for a walk. It was something that didn't want me inside while my mom was alone. I was terrified of what would happen to her, and I threw it open. Now no force was there, and the door slammed into the wall. We went to the second to last photograph and saw a face peeking out of my room. Like a child, but dark grayish and with black eyes, which was creepy at the time. We thought nothing about that either and sat down. We had cut on the EVP I mentioned earlier and started talking to the dead, though we couldn't understand what they were saying. We cut it off and were curious, so I had asked whatever was there to make a noise. My dad's phone was the type to make a noise once put on and off charge, and it went off once. I said make it happen again after I and my mom looked at each other. It happened again. At this point I was happy and excited, while my mom was in fear. I asked one question I regret to this day. It was, if you are evil, ring the charger, and it rang. Oh, it rang like an automatic rifle from a shooting game. I then asked, are you Satan? If you are, ring it once. I was confident that it wouldn't ring, but it rang. It didn't ring twice or a million times, it just rang once. My phone had died at 80% battery out of nowhere, and my mom looked over and grabbed me. She then told me to recite the Saint Michael the Archangel prayer. And as we did over and over, all I can hear in my head is satanic chanting, though I never asked my mom if she did too. Now to this day, only small things like stuff falling or items not being where I put them happen. Please tell me how to get rid of this evil, which I do believe is Satan himself. My friend has agreed to let me write down some of her scary experiences, and I'm going to share some with you. My friend MK has been a magnet for the abnormal her entire life. When she was little, she would sleepwalk and have sleep paralysis and was witnessing all sorts of absolutely horrible things. Now, I know that it's not uncommon for bad things to happen in stages of sleep paralysis and other things, but the evidence that has convinced both me and MK that this was something more unnatural was the fact that she was so ridiculously young when they happened and had not been introduced to any sort of violence in her life. She lives in an extremely Catholic family that wouldn't introduce her to violence until she was about 13, at which point she promptly got addicted to zombie movies and has absolutely no fear reflex. These first two dreams happened when she was anywhere from 2 to 4 years old, and both happened while she was living in a trailer park. 1. The Burning Man. Through the entire experience, MK's eyes were open, and she was physically moving through her trailer. She was lying on her bed at night when she says she smelled smoke. She got out of bed and went to open her door. Immediately she was engulfed in clouds of suffocating gray. She then walks down the hall and into the living room, and absolutely everything is on fire. The hallucinations were so vivid that she could physically hear the china in the cabinet cracking from the heat, and it was hard to breathe through the smoke. Out of nowhere, in the middle of the room, all of her muscles suddenly stiffened, and she was trapped in her own body. A man then walks away from the fire. His eyes are completely black, and he is burning. She describes that he has a look of fear and anger and pain on his face. She could see his hair had burned from his scalp and saw ash falling from his head. His skin was bubbling and blistering as he turned to charcoal right in front of her eyes. He stood only about 5 feet away from MK. She says the man had a very distinct face and says that even 20 years from now she will remember his face. The man's jaw falls from his skull and hits the floor, melting. He begins to scream. It was an absolutely deafening sound, inhumanly loud. A scream of horror, anger, pain, and fear. The screeching continued for what seemed like forever. Then MK felt like she was falling. She fell, and then the man's screaming cut off, only to be replaced by her own. Her father's face appeared right in front of her. She has been screaming the entire time and had woken up her parents. After that experience they took her to her pediatrician, but he dismissed it as extreme sleepwalking or something like that. When she was older, her parents had told her that her pupils had expanded so much that there was no color left in her irises. She remembers every detail even to this day. And this was only the first of many encounters, paranormal and otherwise. 2. Whispering Heads. In this story, she was living in the same trailer park and was about a year older. MK was sleeping on her bed when she felt cold water drip onto her face and wake her up. It was icy cold and had gotten into her mouth. She sat up and saw all of the floor of her room was covered in a sparkling mist that would swirl around her feet when she walked. The door to her room was open, and she walked out to the hallway, which was covered in black mold. MK's trailer seemed to be tilted, and down the hallway, black water was congregating in the tilted corner. MK describes the scene as cold and wet, with a weird feeling and things dripping from the ceiling. She finally looked up and saw hundreds of heads hanging from the roof that were entwined with wire. Their faces were frozen in agony, and blood was dripping from your eyes, mouth, ears, and everywhere else. The moment she peered upward, all of the heads suddenly turned toward her and started babbling in languages she didn't recognize. She couldn't make sense of what was happening and was terrified as blood dripped on her face. The voices rose in volume until her ears rang. But then once again her house was leveled out and water-free. Her mother and father were with her again, holding her shaking body, saying that a plane or helicopter had flown over and had made a loud noise. To this day she is somewhat unsettled by loud noises. Thank you for listening to these first stories. In case any of you are worried, MK almost never sleepwalks anymore, nor does she have sleep paralysis. But things got worse before they got better. Not only with her own head but with encountering some spirits in the house that her family would later buy. Thank you for listening. Ghost in the Graveyard turned scary, true story. A few years ago, when I was 12, I was at my grandma's house in the country with all of my cousins. There were 5 of us, ages 13, 12, 10, 6, and 4. And we all decided we wanted to play Ghost in the Graveyard, a game played at night where one person hides and the rest try to find them, and when the hider is found, they try to tag one of the seekers, and you let the hider know you've found them by shouting "Ghost in the Graveyard." So the oldest decided they wanted to hide first, my sister. Once they were hidden, I and my cousin, we'll call him Tom, want to go find my sister, we'll call them Dawn. The 2 youngest were too scared to leave the deck. So I and Tom decided to go looking for Dawn. So for reference, my grandma had a huge yard at the time, like big enough for a barn, pool, trampoline, and more. I and Tom approached the propane tank in the yard, and behind it, in the night, you could see a female figure squatting. Tom and I shouted "Ghost in the Graveyard," and the figure swayed a bit but didn't move to chase us. I got a little closer and shouted, "Hey, Dawn. We saw you coming to get us," but the figure remained motionless. We heard the little ones asking us to come back to the deck and let them join me and Tom. We said yes, of course, and we went to search the front yard. Once in the front yard, my sister jumps out from underneath a pine tree and tries to tag us. This immediately sends red flags to me and my cousin. We both turn to Dawn and ask, "Why didn't you try to tag us by the propane tank?" To which Dawn replies with, "I was here the whole time." Tom and I returned to the propane tank, but we couldn't find anyone behind it. In a state of panic, we instructed everyone to return indoors and refrain from informing the girls of the incident. After talking alone, Tom and I concluded it wasn't an animal because of their long, straight hair. We then considered Dawn, but while they would have had time to run to the front yard, the propane tank's location would have caused us to see or hear something run out from behind it toward the front yard. This implies that a stranger was seated behind my grandmother's propane tank, allowing me to approach them within a 6-foot radius. Jump forward to the present, all of us are fairly grown up now. I am 18. I had forgotten about this for a while, but then for some reason it popped back into my head, and I decided to see if it was real and waited for the next time I and my cousins would get together to ask everyone about it. Dawn still says she was definitely not behind the propane tank. And when I asked Tom about it, I asked, "Is this just some weird dream I had, or did this actually happen?" Tom said, "Dude. I thought you didn't remember, and I didn't want to bring it up because I didn't want to sound crazy. That's where the story ends. You don't have to believe me, but it did in fact happen, and it freaks me and Tom out to this very day. Thank you for listening." I'm convinced that I saw my mom's dead best friend the night that she died. So this happened when I was around 7 years old. I'm 17 now, and I only realized how strange it was years after the incident happened. So, when I was around 7 years old, I was staying at my aunt's house in California with my mother. I don't remember why we were staying there, considering it was 10 years ago. All I remember was that it was a difficult time for my mom and my aunt. Everything was fine up until we went to sleep. I'd slept at my aunt's house before this several times, so it was a space I was at least semi-comfortable with. My mom and I had always slept in the same guest bedroom together, as we were this night, and I remember falling asleep pretty early in the evening. That was until I was woken up in the middle of the night, probably around 12ish if I had to guess, to the feeling that someone was staring at me. I guess my subconscious could somehow feel that someone was there even though I was dead asleep. I opened my eyes to see a woman standing at the foot of the bed. She was wearing some kind of gown and just staring right at me, with this sad expression on her face. She had mid-length hair and bangs and was just taller than my mother if I had to guess. She was also slightly glowing a light blue tint, like I could see her face perfectly even in the dark bedroom. At first I thought it might have just been my mom, until I looked over and saw her sound asleep next to me. After that, my memory goes blank, and all I remember is waking up the next morning with this feeling like I knew it wasn't a dream. Fast forward to around a week ago. Up until this point, I'd thought about the incident sometimes, but I just chalked it up to being my aunt or something. I was having a conversation with my mom at dinner when she brought up the topic of ghosts. I decided to tell her about that night and about the woman I saw so many years ago. When I told her it all happened when I was around 7 on that trip to my aunt's house, her face completely changed. She completely went silent for a few minutes before telling me about why we went to my aunt's house that day in the first place. It was because her best friend, we'll call her Natalie for privacy reasons, had attempted to take her own life 3 days earlier. Natalie initially failed and was kept in a hospital near my aunt's house for the next 3 days on life support until her family had made the ultimate decision to take her off. This is why we went to my aunt's house that night, because my mom wanted to say goodbye to her. The night she died was the same night we stayed with my aunt, and the same night I saw that woman at the edge of the bed. When my mom told me this, my blood ran completely cold. I asked my mom to show me pictures of Natalie just to be sure, and even now, even to this day, that face was undeniably identical to the woman's. The same bangs, the same eyes, everything was the same. I shiver just thinking about it now. But the main thing I wonder most is, if that really was Natalie coming to me and my mother as a final goodbye, then why was she so sad? She looked as if she was frowning, her ghost, I mean. The saddest I've ever seen anyone, with this look of pure sorrow on her face. If you're skeptical of my story, that's fine, take it as you will. I just had to share this story that's left me shaken since I made the realization. Once a believer, always a believer. This happened a few years back, when my now husband and I just began dating. He was living in a lovely house on a hill with his mom and stepfather. I have always been a believer in the paranormal. I even used to see things back when I was younger that still send chills up my spine. Somehow, I put a block to it according to a close family friend of mine who is a psychic, but part of me wanted to experience what I used to see again, now that I am older and feel that I could handle it. Anyway, when I first started going over to his house, I remember one specific night he had asked me to come over for dinner as his stepdad was cooking up a storm. I remember sitting in the kitchen at their island and having a conversation with both him and his stepdad when all of a sudden, the doorbell rang. They had a habit of keeping the front door open for their two dogs to stare out and gaze at the neighbors and birds that passed by. "Who was that?" I asked, looking around to see if we were expecting some more company. I knew something was wrong when my husband and stepdad looked at each other with a smirk. "You'll have to get used to that," his stepdad laughed. "It was Edna." "Who is Edna?" I asked, preparing myself for the answer I knew was coming. "Our ghost," my husband said. "She's harmless. She just likes to play pranks, especially on people who are new to our home. Once you get used to her, she won't bother you anymore. But the more you're afraid and react, the more she'll bother you." I tried to hide my fear the best I could, as I started to spend the weekend sleeping over. Late at night, there would be loud knocks coming from the basement. Footsteps going up and down the stairs when everyone had gone to bed. But I have to say what really put the cherry on top of this harmless haunting was when I was alone in my husband's room watching TV one night. He was in the basement doing his laundry, and his mom and stepdad were in the family room a floor down from me watching a movie. I heard footsteps coming up the stairs, but thought nothing of it and kept my attention on the TV. From the corner of my eye, I could make out a woman coming up the stairs who I assumed was his mom. "Hi, Val," she said softly. "Hi," I replied. I felt rude that I didn't bother to turn my face to actually see her, but I was so in tune with the show I was watching and heard the footsteps stop when she reached her room. Not too long after, I heard footsteps coming up the stairs again, and this time it made me jump. It was his mom, who came into the room to say hi. "I didn't hear you go back downstairs again," I gasped. She looked at me confused, telling me she had been downstairs the entire time and this is the first she is coming back up the stairs. I was scared, yes, I admit it, even regretting what I had mentioned before about wanting to experience the paranormal again. She helped calm me down and said, "Edna is just playing around with you." Edna was the previous owner of the home who died there of dementia and Alzheimer's. I guess part of her didn't ever want to leave, or she had some unfinished business to take care of. After that day, she would still pull some harmless pranks, like things going missing, things being placed in one spot and moved to another, my mother-in-law's windows being washed and her seeing her apparition in the window smiling, my niece's toys being knocked over and no one there, and of course, messing with that damn doorbell again. My now in-laws have sold the house and moved down to Florida, but I still wonder to this day if the new owners are experiencing what we had. I hate to say that I miss these harmless pranks. I'll never forget you, Edna. Something in my room at night. I recently moved to a new apartment, and for the first time ever in my life, I'm having sleep paralysis. Every single time I feel a presence, someone touching my side and back with their fingers. I have abandoned my room at this point and never go in there anymore unless I have to. This isn't the only reason, there have been other incidents as well. A couple of months ago I was lying in my bed, and in the reflection of my TV, I saw a being about 3 feet tall standing and staring at me. As soon as I noticed it, in a strangely inhuman way, it ducked down incredibly fast out of view. I immediately got up and looked under my bed, and there was nothing I could see. This happened to me when I was a kid, too. I was having a nightmare about a short hooded figure about the size of a child, and when I ran up to it to see what it was, I felt a sharp pain in my left side and woke up. When I opened my eyes, I saw a being in the darkness standing about a foot from my face that was about 3 feet tall as well. After seeing it for a couple of seconds, it vanished into thin air as if it turned invisible. Well, the sleep paralysis with it touching my back also happened on that same exact side I felt a sharp pain in when I was a kid that woke me up. It got awful. I had to abandon the room I was sleeping in, as I mentioned. The last couple of nights I was in there, something terrifying happened. One night I felt something get up on my bed next to me, moving my mattress. I could feel the weight of it. The next night I woke and saw what looked like the hand of a child reaching up from under my bed and the reflection of my mirror trying to grab me. Well, this is where shit gets really scary. The literal next day, my roommate tells me how his coworker had a weird experience. A being reached up from under the line in a restaurant when he was closing alone and grabbed his leg. It then tried to do it again. The thing is, he was alone, and there is no room for a person down there to hide at all. I didn't tell him what happened to me, and we have no contact with each other at all. Things like this have been happening to me since I was a kid. Literally, it doesn't matter where I go, it follows me everywhere. I don't know if it is one thing or multiple different things happening to me. I've had experiences where a man talking to me wakes me up, it's always the same voice. Or another time someone clapped their hands directly in my face, but I was home alone. Recently, even though I've been sleeping in the living room with my cats, I've been woken up twice now by a voice talking directly in my ear. The last time it happened, it was so loud it hurt my ear. One night I got drunk and was taunting it. I know it was a stupid idea, but I was at the end of my rope and feeling really stressed out. I told it how it's a coward for hiding and that I'm going to find it. I was laughing. Well, it yelled directly in my ear one morning saying, "Aren't you going to laugh at me?" Things at different homes have been moving on their own. There have been lights turning themselves off. Cats chasing and growling at something I can't see. This is bizarre, but just a couple of weeks ago, when I was watching TV with my roommate, I saw something duck down behind my mattress. I currently have it in my living room. The thing is, whatever it was, it couldn't have been larger than half a foot. What's even that small? And when we got up to look, there was nothing there. I know some people will probably say it's hallucinations or that it's just sleep paralysis, but it happens when I'm awake as well. I feel it's important to note I haven't been having just paranormal or supernatural type experiences, but I also saw a gray alien as well. One night when I was walking home, around 2 in the morning, I saw a very tall, slender being with no clothes on crouched behind some bushes right outside my bedroom window. It had a teardrop head and absolutely massive black eyes and was just staring at me. Barely any nose or mouth, no ears. I'd say if it stood up, it would be about 8 or 9 feet tall. There was another time I woke up with my shirt on backwards and blood in my mouth. Had a dream that I was on a table somewhere I've never been, and a gray was standing over me smiling. I don't know what to do, I don't know what this all is. I feel like I am a magnet for the weird, and I hate it. It has ruined my life, I am not normal anymore, and I am so depressed and anxious. I constantly carry a knife everywhere I go in my apartment and am scared to sleep. I'm always watching my surroundings and feel like there is always something watching me, ready to attack me at any moment. What do I do? Does anyone have any similar experiences or have any idea why this is happening to me? I feel so isolated and like nobody believes me. I graduated high school in 1998 and was dating a girl with all kinds of issues who I should not have been seeing. My mother said if I stayed in a relationship with her, I could not live at home. We lived in a small rural town, and my girlfriend's home was several miles away. I decided to live in my car, smart, I know, while I figured things out. I would park my car at the gate entrance to a field near her home and sleep there at night, walking through some woods and across the field when I left her house. Her 2 dogs would follow me to the car and then go back home after I was inside. Not far into my new setup, one night as I approached my car, I swear I heard the beat of drums. Not drum set drumming, but like tribal sounding drums. It was somewhat faint, but it was distinct in the silence of the rural area. It was then I recalled the stories I had heard in elementary school of a supposedly satanic cult in the area. They had some land at the end of a dead-end road about a mile north of where I was parked. I became instantly scared and climbed into my car quickly. The back seat would fold down, and I could fit halfway into the trunk of the car. That's how I slept for the several weeks I lived there. Every night I could hear the drums. One night the dogs didn't leave my car. Rather, I awoke to them growling at something, bumping the underside of my vehicle as they moved around beneath me. The final straw came one night after getting into my car. As I sat in the driver's seat, preparing to climb into the back, I happened to make out a silhouette against the horizon in the field I had just crossed. It was a human form made of shadow silhouetted against the less dark night sky. Thinking my girlfriend or her father, who didn't know I was out there, followed me. I turned on my headlights to verify who it was and discovered that nobody stood in the field. I had enough of that and drove about 10 miles away to the parking lot of a rural church and felt better sleeping there. Needless to say, that relationship did not last, and I moved on to other things not long after that. Almost a year later I became friends with an older lady who lived nearby. I found out she happened to live on the dead-end road where I swore I heard the drum sounds coming from. I asked her one time if she ever had any strange experiences or any harassment from the cult at the end of the road. She told me the cult had been gone for about a decade at that time, that they had left before her family even moved onto the street, but she did have odd things happening there after first moving in. She said that her 3 daughters would routinely see shadowy figures moving outside between the trees on their property and also hear what she called Indian drums. She said this without knowing what had happened to me. Once, she said her youngest daughter, 4 years old at the time, was sitting by the stereo speakers in the living room with her ear up to them. Someone in the family asked her what she was doing, and she said, listening. They found it somewhat humorous because the stereo wasn't on and asked her what she was listening to. The young daughter looked at them and replied, "They say, there is justification in killing your parents." Freaky stuff. I knew then that what I experienced almost a year before was not the cult that had long ago moved away but something far more sinister that had remained in the area. The following is a true account of my experience attempting an all-night hike on November 18th. I am sharing this because I assume somebody somewhere may have the experience or knowledge to explain away the events that I am about to describe and maybe provide some clarity regarding what animal I could be encountering. Once again, if anyone has an explanation for these events, please let me know. These are all real. 2 days ago I went to a state park a while north of me to attempt an all-night hiking adventure that I thought would be fun and maybe a little scary, but only scary enough to make a good story, you know? The most I was prepared for was fighting coyotes over my food, but I was very wrong. Without boring you with details, I will immediately begin describing what happened. I got to East Fork State Park in Batavia around 7 p.m. Given the time of year, it was already dark. I myself am very aware of the effects that aesthetics can have on the body, so I began by picking a spot near the lake and cooking my food. I placed a T-bone steak onto my propane grill and began to cook it. However, after turning around to rummage through my pack for a second flashlight, my hand stumbled across something cold and hard. I picked it up, and to my utter confusion, it was the steak that I could have sworn I prepared already. I looked down to see my propane grill running, but with nothing on it. In the woods, your senses are already off a bit, and events that otherwise wouldn't worry you are quite frightening in the woods. I was immediately put off by this occurrence, as I am not on any medication, nor do I have any known mental illnesses. In an attempt to regain my comfort, I took the steak and once again placed it on the grill. I stared at it and watched it sizzle. I even waited to be able to smell the steam before I took my eye off of it. I then continued looking for my flashlight, and all was well for a few hours. By this event I had hiked maybe a mile. I was moving quite slow compared to normal, and the steak thing was still on my mind but not worrying. I came around a bend where the trees began to get more dense and sat lower when I saw a deer standing maybe 20 yards ahead, perfectly positioned, facing me on the trail. I was not worried by this yet, though, and actually reached for my phone to take a picture. I wanted to wait for the deer to turn its head, which I assumed it would, as deer eyes are placed on the sides of the head, before taking the photo. I stood there making eye contact with this buck for a solid 45 seconds before I began to question things. Eventually, I gave up and took the photo and then began to approach the deer to get it to move so I could continue the hike. As I got closer, however, the deer remained unfazed. Baffled, I took my phone out once again and began recording. I approached the deer slowly and was able to get within 10 feet of it before I heard it exhale. It hopped off. I was extremely surprised by this behavior but not yet scared. I continued hiking, and by this point I had stopped thinking about the steak event. For about another hour I was granted a peaceful hike until I reached an area where the path came to a bald spot in the trees. Looking around was cut short, as the absolutely pungent stench of burning hair and rotting flesh was the only thing I could detect. The smell was so incredibly present that I immediately began to vomit. This is nothing strange because I am typically very sensitive to smells, and my stomach is easily upset. However, what was not normal was that I kept vomiting. I continued to vomit all over the ground, losing every single thing I had eaten. I heaved probably about 5 times before dry heaving another 3. By this point I was lying on the ground in excruciating pain and crying. My vision was clouded by tears, but between my forceful blinks, I could see my hands illuminated in a soft red glow, and when I stopped heaving, I looked up and saw the light over the trees with no source. Sort of like if someone was holding a really bright flashlight at you from meters away. I scrambled to my feet, and placed my hand in vomit accidentally, which is important later, and began running. I had no idea what was going on, but I assumed I was extremely ill. Between the hallucinations and vomiting, I was convinced I was poisoned or ate something I should not have at some point. I ripped out my flashlight and began walking. The way back was normal, and besides my horrible stomachache, I was generally fine. However, upon crossing the base of the peninsula that I cooked on, I felt my flashlight get jerked out of my hand. I turned back unbothered, thinking the string had been caught on a stick, but I realized that I was in an area of strictly sand, with no vertical objects anywhere near. I turned back in the direction and continued. At this point I was no longer afraid. I was feeling that kind of fear you feel as a child when you first wake up from a bad dream, where the back of my throat got that odd feeling. I made it up a rather steep hill and looked back at the peninsula, and what I saw genuinely has my mind in shambles to this day. I saw myself turned around looking for my flashlight. Frozen with confusion and fear, I just watched. The other me searched frantically and eventually fell to his hands and knees searching. I then heard something that I cannot express enough terror with words to convey the emotion I was feeling. I watched in the distance as I began to physically rip myself apart. I ripped off my own limbs and began to eat my fingers. I once again began to vomit, and the stench of burning hair once again returned. This time I was only puking bile and heaved twice before standing straight up again. Looking back at the peninsula, I saw nothing. The hallucination was gone, but the smell remained. I began running and found the trail again. I actually passed a camping shelter with 3 walls and a very slanted roof, which I did not remember from the journey before, but the short bridge afterwards solidified in my mind that I was on the right path. I began to run, guided only by spots of dim moonlight on the ground. I sprinted longer than I believe I ever have before and eventually made it to the exit, where I immediately threw my stuff into the passenger seat and drove away. I still don't know how to explain what happened to me, and there are many feelings and details that I left out to keep this as short as I could while maintaining a degree of explanation. I am begging, if anyone recognizes these as symptoms of an illness or psychoactive drug, please tell me. If this is something else entirely, please tell me. I am begging for an explanation. I see my psychiatrist tomorrow and have already consulted my doctor. I appreciate anyone's considerations, and please try to provide me with an explanation of what the hell happened to me. I was 6 when the Phoenix lights happened. Everyone on our street ran out and stood there to watch. The lights were bright, steady, and seemed to pulsate. They moved not fast, but not slow either. They seemed to move at a gentle, purposeful pace. What I mostly remember is the silence. They didn't make any noise, and it seemed like nothing else did either. There weren't any birds, cicadas, or plane or helicopter noises. The wind barely seemed to blow. They lasted about 10 minutes before vanishing, and even after they left, that quiet stillness remained. No one who was there buys the "it was the Air Force" excuse. People in our neighborhood were actually angry about that, as if it insulted their intelligence. I'm not sure what they were, but it's made me hesitant to completely dismiss the extraterrestrial stories. My boyfriend believes now, the consequences, however, will haunt me forever. My boyfriend and I heard my voice, but it wasn't me. Paranormal or parallel? Believer and previous non-believer seeking opinions, I've experienced a few small nods towards the paranormal in my life, 20F, although my BF, 21M, has never. Today we're both very much believers in anything and everything you've got to say, so please. Let me know if you've had similar experiences or have any advice on what our next step should be. Otherwise, enjoy our lives changing in 10 seconds. My boyfriend and I were playing video games in our bedroom on my birthday 5 nights ago for probably an hour or so. He was on our bed playing Xbox, I was on my PC not even a foot away. When we finally got off the game, we both took our headphones off, and he looked at me, saying, "Do you want to smoke a bowl?" I responded with yes and joined him on our bed. Around 10 seconds after he initially asked to smoke, he went to grab his phone, and I was just looking at him. The whole house was silent as it was 11:30 p.m. Then a female-sounding voice, almost identical to mine, but not quite, clear as day said, "Can we take a bowl?" I wasn't expecting to hear my own voice, so I still don't know if I'm trying to think it wasn't, but we both heard it. It was only a few words off from what my BF said, so we first thought maybe a recording, hacker, device relay, Alexa, or cops. We truly have been over everything, and it's a dead end every time. It was a completely different sentence altogether, so we got over that option very quickly. My BF had never believed in any type of alternative universe before this, but it's the only logical conclusion. We're both convinced this was a glitch, and in some other timeline, I said that to him instead. It's happened way too many times, me saying that exact phrase and exact scenario even in the same tone. It's the perfect setup to make us question what the actual duck happened. Was this maybe my past best friend visiting me on my birthday, legitimately wanting to smoke with us? I've been in a hard place ever since she passed in November of 22. Begging for communication or really anything from her. Could this possibly have been a good reason for spirits to come right in instead? A mimic? A ghost? A demon? We both got immediate chills and left the house to my parents. I was hotter than I'd ever been in my life that whole night, sweat beating down my face while I'd been calm as day hours later. I woke up to a horrible dream of me and my BF in our own bed at home. In the dream I woke up, rushed to the end of the bed to see a demon figure, and before I could even react, I was awake at my parents' house, drenched in sweat, shaking like a chihuahua. My BF was dead asleep at the time. I couldn't even shake him up for quite a while. I've read about mimics and how they prey on those who are alone by sounding like a loved one or even yourself. But I have yet to find others like this specific scenario. How come we both heard and then felt the exact same? The odds are almost non-existent on the mental or physical health factor, because even then my BF and I would have had similar symptoms but not hallucinated the same. Fast forward 2 days later. My BF and I have to fly across the country to visit my family. We tried to put this out of our minds the best we could. Unfortunately, I don't think I'll ever live my life the same. I finally let my guard down and thought to myself, nothing can come with me. I'm safe. That was until we saw them. My boyfriend points out an older lady, very witch-like, the kind you see and just know they have too much knowledge, you know? But right in front of her, I pointed out a man, the spitting image of a demon in human form. He had leather and chains and a cloak/cape. Dressed in black head to toe, with sanpaku eyes, very violent looking. He is only staring at me. In my eyes, I can literally feel it after I looked away. Not just him, though, witchy too, until they had to physically turn their heads to continue looking into me. Spooky enough, right? We'll just get this ducking mind duck. My boyfriend didn't see the guy. Now you tell me how in the world he sees this witchy older lady staring at me 2 feet away from the man in front of her and doesn't see him? Once we shared our concerns and agreed that was not normal. I realized I could just be losing my mind. Or, I'm being watched. The next day we're out to dinner with my family, and I go to use the restroom. I was hesitant because it was scary to me and dark, and I just didn't want to be alone, not even for a piss. I heard my boyfriend joking with my family about how I was scared. So of course I thought he was the one who came up to the bathroom door and said PSSSD. He wasn't. Another thing, maybe related or not, we just moved into this house 4 months ago. Ever since I have been feeling so drained, with no energy, my mood has been erratic at times. Maybe I'm vulnerable? I'm so lost right now but trying to stay positive. I also want to say that no, we were not just intoxicated or whatever, we didn't even get our bowl on my birthday because it spooked us too bad. Frown, we have carbon monoxide detectors in every single room in our house. They are on and working and have been thoroughly checked. No mold, no leaks. I appreciate the concerns, but unfortunately that's not our problem solved here. Let me know what you think. Glitch? Ghost? Mimic? Loved one? Any feedback is greatly appreciated. We are still very jumbled over this and do not quite know what to make of the situation. I don't usually talk about this much because people don't really believe me. But when I was in 6th grade, I fell asleep one night and was awoken in the middle of the night. I couldn't see my alarm clock because of where he was sitting. But to lay out my room, I had a bunk bed on the left side of the room, my computer desk, which had a chair, TV, and, well, my alarm clock, was on the right side of the room, and my bedroom window was at the end of my bed facing towards the right side of the room. I was awoken in the middle of the night and naturally looked over to my alarm clock to see what time it was. And that's when I couldn't move. I felt like my muscles were locked up, I couldn't yell or talk no matter how much I tried, and then I saw it. A man sitting in my computer chair with the moonlight hitting off of him in a flat pilgrim-looking top hat staring at me. I felt my heart racing trying to figure out what to do, but all I was able to do was stare at him. It felt like hours of a constant staring contest and the sound of my heart racing in my chest. And then I was able to blink, and he was gone. And I could see my alarm clock again at 6:30 a.m., but I don't know when it began. In the morning my computer chair was faced towards my bed, and when I told my mom's now ex, he just stared at me and asked what it looked like and where it was. I told him, and he looked for himself and didn't say anything. The following night I heard scratching on my ceiling above my bunk bed. Again, another sleepless night. It came to the point where I started to fall asleep in class. And was getting in trouble. After that week, though, to this day I haven't been visited or bothered by this man. I have adopted a rescue German Shepherd dog. I'm not sure if he's been protecting me or if I was just having a case of severe sleep paralysis that week. But I've always been a firm believer in ghosts, not supernatural entities like the Mothman or Bigfoot. But I don't know if it was sleep paralysis or if it was real. I do know one thing: I never want to see it again. I'm sharing this to see if anyone else has had this experience this severe or at all, in hopes of finding closure in what really happened that week. Thank you if you took the time to listen to this. The albino deer. My father is an avid collector of Native American art, mostly West Coast / Haida Gwaii and Anishinaabe woodland art. He was searching Kijiji one day and came across a gentleman who was selling a collection of Native American masks. He contacted the seller and found that he only lived an hour away. We decided to take the trip and arrived at this old wartime house. The lawn was a mess, browning grass and unkempt, the windows were covered in dust and cobwebs, and the paint was peeling on the exterior. We didn't think anyone lived there but proceeded to try the side door. We knocked and heard loud barking on the other side of the door. Shortly, a man arrived to greet us and told us the masks were in a bunkie around back. We followed him to his bunkie / shed, where he had the 4 masks laid out on a sofa. 3 were West Coast styled masks, and 1 was African. We agreed to take them all, paid him, and started making our way back to the car. The seller told us as we walked back to our car that he had a lot more Native American artifacts that he was trying to unload and that we were more than welcome to take a look. My father couldn't pass up the opportunity, and so we proceeded to follow the man into his home. Once inside, we were intensely aware of the abundance of angel dolls / paintings that lined the walls. There were literally hundreds of them, and we couldn't help but think that perhaps they were strategically placed, as they all seemed to be looking at you as you walked around the house. We proceeded to follow the seller into the basement, where he started sliding boxes over to us filled with native artifacts and trinkets, tomahawks, pipes, mucklucks, crow's feet, etc. My father asked the seller why he wanted to get rid of his collection, and the seller replied, "Do you believe in ghosts or spirits?" My father and I turned to each other with a slight chuckle and replied, "Depends." That's when he told us his story. He had been driving back from work on a country road a few weeks before and had seen something white on the side of the road. Curious, he pulled his truck over to investigate. Upon doing so, he realized it was an albino deer, that had been hit by a car. Seeing the spiritual significance of this animal, he chose to take its femur bone. He didn't leave an offering in return. He returned home and proudly displayed the femur bone on his mantelpiece. It didn't take long for his daughter to start having visitations from a malicious spirit who informed her that severe harm would come to the family if her father didn't return the bone to its proper resting place. At first, he thought it was just a child's imagination, but soon he started to have strange things happen to himself. He returned the bone to where he found it and left an offering of tobacco, apologizing for what he had done. The spirit visitations ended, but his daughter still had fears attached to anything that was Native American related. We took this story with a grain of salt, thinking maybe he was just trying to spin a good story. We took a couple of his boxes of artifacts / trinkets at no extra charge and left. A couple of weeks later, my father and I were en route to see a friend when we had a sudden urge to turn around. We couldn't explain why, but we knew we had to turn around and head back home. No more than 15 minutes after turning around, I spotted something on the side of the highway coming out of the forest. I grabbed my father's arm and started frantically yelling, "Pull over! Pull over!" He pulled over to the side of the highway, and I pointed to the forest with my hand shaking. There, coming out of the forest, was an albino doe. With her was a non-albino fawn. We watched in disbelief as this albino doe walked right up to my passenger side window and gazed in at me. Her breath fogged up the glass. We were gazing into each other's eyes, and I was frozen in disbelief. Nothing made sense at this moment. But the peace and serenity I felt was unlike anything I had experienced before. Cars passed by on the highway completely unaware. It was as if time had frozen in place and all that existed was my father, the albino deer, her fawn, and myself. This moment lasted a good 5 to 10 minutes, and then she turned around and headed back into the forest. My father and I sat for a good while afterwards wondering if what we had just seen was real. We questioned our sanity and wondered how this could be. Mere coincidence? Perhaps. But what are the odds? We returned home and promised ourselves we would return to the spot a couple of days later with our cameras / phones to snap a picture. We needed to have proof. Otherwise, no one would believe us, and we wouldn't believe our own eyes / minds. Lol. We tried returning to the spot a few days later, but we took another route to get there and got incredibly lost on the back roads. My father began to get frustrated and pulled over to the side of this country road to check a map. He pulled up the map while I tried to get the GPS on his BlackBerry. 5 minutes went by of us trying to fight to find where we were, and then my dad gave up. He closed the map and looked up in front of us and started freaking out. He grabbed my arm and started frantically telling me to get the camera ready. I looked up, and there in front of the car was the albino doe. She was facing our car and just watching us. She turned around and started walking up the middle of the road. We followed slowly behind, and I tried capturing pictures on my LG slide phone and my dad's BlackBerry. Every photo came out fuzzy or corrupted. The albino deer led us right back to the highway where we first saw her. There, we pulled over again as she began to wander into a nearby field. I got out of the car to try to get a better picture, and just as I did, an Escalade pulled up behind me, and out jumped a lady with a professional camera. She looked at me and exclaimed, "You're chasing the white deer too, eh?" She told me she would take some shots with her camera and would send them to me. Turns out, she was a wildlife photographer and had been following the deer for some time. What are the odds? I gave her my father's email information, and we parted ways. We waited a good 2 weeks for those pictures to arrive, excited that now we would finally have validation. They came one night as I returned home from school, and we eagerly opened them on our laptop. As we started scrolling through them, there was a loud electric static sound, and our laptop screen turned off instantly. We tried turning it back on frantically and noticed that the back of the laptop was now black as there had been a power surge. Our laptop was completely fried. Clearly, it was a WTF moment. My father grabbed his BlackBerry in the hopes we could view them that way, and I kid you not, the BlackBerry died. Fried as well. Wasn't even plugged in. We took them into Best Buy, as well as an independent electronics repair shop, and they told us there was no repairing either unit. My father tried accessing his email at work in the hopes of gaining the pictures that way, and his email account was now locked. It was as though it didn't even exist. We had no way of explaining what had happened. How can both devices get completely fried and then the email account gets locked? We had a lot of skeptics on our hands and an abundance of frustration. We returned to the albino deer location many times over the following years and never managed to spot her again. We left an offering of tobacco and fruit in the hopes that somehow that would bring her back into our life. We actually missed her presence. Years later, my father was driving by the spotting location and saw a couple coming out of a trailer park. He flagged them down and asked them if they had ever seen an albino deer in the area. The wife looked at him with sorrow in her eyes and said, "I'm sorry to tell you that she was hit by a car a couple of years back. We miss seeing her as well." My father got goosebumps, as that is how the story had begun and how it ends. So this happened 8 months ago. I was traveling to a religious place with 3 of my friends. My best friend was driving the car, and we were all sober. No drinks. Nothing at all. As we were driving uphill on a mountain, I and my best friend saw something very eerie. It looked like half man, half woman. It was 7 to 8 feet tall. Muscles of a giant man but with breasts. We could only see the back and the side as we crossed it. I realized it was something paranormal, so I just asked my friend if he saw something. And he said he did as well, whereas the 2 people in the back said they don't know what we're talking about. I immediately warned my best friend not to look back at the thing. I knew it was bad luck. The best friend did, and he said, "Bro, I just saw a face with no eyes or nose, just lips smiling and tongue out." At the same time, the other friends were curious, and they looked back as well. They said they couldn't see anything, which couldn't be possible at all. I realized what happened, so I told him to keep on driving. We got into an accident while parking our car. Maybe we were scared, or maybe it was bad luck. I still don't know what happened that day. We just felt safe to reach our home back alive. We still don't know what that creature was or why the others couldn't see it. When I was young, we lived in a house that was built in 1910. It was a lovely house, but a murder had taken place there, and the house was sold to us for very cheap. Not to make this too long, but this is what my family members and I experienced. We were kids around this time, about 20 years ago. My sister was lying in bed waiting for my mom to get done using the restroom so she could go to sleep with her. Well, in the front of the room was a window, and just outside the window a white, glowing woman appeared. My sister freaked while my mom quickly rushed in. My mom also saw the figure, and both still back it to this day. Brother went to use the restroom one night and came face to face with a very tall black figure. He ran to my mom's room, where he cried himself to sleep. Brother and sister were playing patty cake essentially instead of going to bed one night. As they played around, a large lump elevated the blanket and moved across the bed. My brother thought it was me, but I was only a baby at the time. He smacked the blanket for it to only get back up and travel to the end of the bed where it disappeared. Both back this to this day. I woke up one night to get a drink of water from the kitchen. It's probably 1 a.m., and no one is awake. When I get my glass of water, I hear a loud scream/shriek. It's a scream that will haunt me forever and have a permanent spot in my brain. At dinner, the whole family would hear constant footsteps going up and down our stairs. Dad always brushed these things off. The chandelier would also swing at random times. Mom would catch glimpses of a little boy darting across the hallway as well as her clothes being pulled when she would do the dishes. I'm glad we moved out of that house because it was scary as shit. The paranormal experiences I had in the house I grew up in. I was born in Miami, Florida, and at the age of 1, my family faced the utter destruction of Hurricane Andrew. Being that our home was destroyed, my parents received a settlement. Torn between rebuilding or relocating, they ultimately opted for a change of scenery. Which, as an adult, starting a family in a location as dangerous as Miami, especially after experiencing the aftermath of nature's wrath, I can say I would make the same decision. So my parents took me and my older sister up to a place known as Uniontown, Pennsylvania. Nothing much to look at, but I grew to love it. This is about the paranormal experiences I had as a teenager in that old 2-story farmhouse my parents snagged for almost nothing. At first, it seemed like a blessing. My parents worked tirelessly to restore that house to its full potential. Though even considering the settlement, my family could still be considered lower class. They poured everything they had into that property, and I am grateful for everything they were able to provide to me and my sister. This house was located right on Route 40, which was a pretty busy road day and night, so cars passing every 5 seconds was to be expected. It was loud, and you never really felt far from society because of it. Yet, we lived on 8 acres, 5 of which were heavily forested at the rear of the property. We really only had the time and equipment to maintain the 3 acres immediately surrounding the house. The street was maybe 10 to 15 yards from our front door. I loved exploring in the woods with my neighbors. A boy and his sister, who were twins, my age, and to the right of our home. Also their neighbor, who was the oldest of us all, and to the right of their home. We were all each other had in the area, so we spent a lot of time together. Albeit our parents had their differences. So, needless to say, there was a lot of drama between them that made it hard for us kids to hang out. Didn't stop us from finding a way, though. Exploring by myself one day, I came across an old brick foundation that was no more than the size of a single room. To this day, I don't know what purpose it served, I just know inside the foundation was littered with glass bottles of all shapes and sizes. No labels and no way of knowing what they actually contained. It could have been a small building meant to store drinks, or maybe even a bar long ago. Regardless, that foundation always made me wonder what purpose this property actually served back in its early days. I remember having this dream, or I guess nightmare, the entire time I lived in that house. You know how you are awake and conscious, but not exactly awake? That's what this dream always felt like. I was there but not there, if that makes any sense. I would be in my own room, yet it always seemed to be much darker than usual. Every time I would wake to this man, who initially was never actually looking directly at me, yet he was speaking to me calmly. The atmosphere was as if I was answering to an elder for something I had done wrong. I always felt like I was in trouble. After several minutes of conversing back and forth with this man, he would, out of nowhere, lunge at me, screaming frantically in my face. And speaking of faces, the only feature he had was a mouth. The sheer shock of him lunging at me with such ferocious rage would always jolt me awake to a cold sweat. It was such a common thing that for a while, I was terrified to go to sleep, let alone with the lights off. I never really told anyone about it because in my mind as a young boy, it was just my overactive imagination. However, at the age of about 14, I convinced my parents to let me try cyber school. Being an introvert, I hated school and my parents knew it. Thankfully they were considerate enough to let me have a crack at it. My cyber school didn't require any specific log-on time, as long as you completed your work. That being said, my routine became sleeping all day and staying up all night. One night in particular I will never forget. I was sitting there at the computer well after midnight with the only light source being the computer itself. For context, our computer was positioned right next to the doorway separating the kitchen from the living room. Sitting at the computer, the kitchen would be to the immediate right. I remember my mother coming downstairs that night, walking through the living room and into the kitchen, telling me to get to sleep. I, of course, had no intentions of going to sleep anytime soon, so I just waited for her to do what she had to and go back upstairs to bed. But she never turned any lights on. I remember glancing over at the kitchen, wondering why she wouldn't turn the light on. And what she was even doing because I couldn't hear any movement. As I'm thinking this, I see a black silhouette step forward from the right into view and just stand there. From my perspective, they were facing to the left and not paying any attention to me. Keep in mind this all happened within seconds. When the figure stepped forward, I assumed it was my mother, so I looked away and then back again. As I did, I could see the shape of the figure's head looking in my direction. I stood up, and for whatever insane reason, I decided to enter the kitchen. This is hard to explain, but the closer I got, the more difficult it was to see the figure, as if it was fading away the closer I got, until I found myself in the center of the kitchen pulling the chain attached to the ceiling fan in order to turn on the light. The light's on, and there I was, alone in the kitchen. In fact, the entire downstairs was empty. I honestly don't know why at the time this didn't freak me out, but it didn't faze me at all. In fact, aside from asking my mother if she had come downstairs that night the following day, only to discover she hadn't. I completely put it out of my mind. That is, until my sister explained a similar experience. Years later my sister told me about an experience she had one night where she was awakened to someone rummaging through her vanity stand directly adjacent to the foot of her bed. She had a lot of paper and writing utensils on it, and she had assumed it was me in the middle of the night looking for something to use for whatever I might have needed it for. She said she sat up and scolded me to get out when she noticed that same dark silhouette turn and face her. She said she knew immediately that it wasn't me and she was mistaken. The figure apparently began walking slowly towards her bed and, out of natural panic, pulled the covers over her head. I assume she eventually fell asleep and, similar to my response, just put it out of her mind. The interesting thing about these two experiences is that where I saw the figure and where she saw it were in the exact same place but on separate floors. Where she saw it was directly above where I saw it. I don't know if that's at all significant, but it always struck me as an intriguing coincidence. Fast forward to a few years later, around the age of 17 now, I went down to my neighbor's house to hang out when they confronted me with a strange sense of frustration, questioning why we had a party the night before but didn't invite them. I remember feeling confused because we didn't have a party. I just know there was no way anyone in our household could have had a gathering of any kind. We as a family didn't even associate with enough people to even have a party. Regardless, we were all home that night, and there was zero evidence of what they were saying to be true. I tried to explain that we didn't have a party at all, and I don't understand what they're even talking about. They said all the lights were on at our house at all hours of the night, and it was clear that the house was full of people. They said we were being obnoxiously loud and arrogant, blaring music and allowing one of the attendees to drive up and down the road honking their horn and being absolutely disrespectful to everyone else living in the area. I had no idea what to say at that point because in a situation like that, nothing you can say seems valid to the person who is absolutely sure such an event occurred. However, I was at a loss for words, eventually retreating back to my own home humiliated and confused about what they saw. Almost to the point of questioning whether or not we actually did have people over and somehow I just missed it? No way. My time there ultimately left me with more questions than answers, but unfortunately, and I apologize for how anticlimactic this ending is, those were all the experiences I had, or at least can remember. Something about that old farmhouse still makes me wonder what dark mysteries it harbored. I believe something was attached to that place and for the time, possibly to me, because when we finally did move away from the property, those nightmares I had of the faceless man immediately ceased. That old farmhouse no longer stands, and all things considered, maybe it's for the best. Or maybe whatever dark entity that was bound there, is now free. I have had so many. Starting when I was 3 years old. I won't enumerate all of them, but a couple I had in one house in particular stand out. My husband and I had just bought a new house. I was taking time off from work to unpack things and set up the house. He was at work that day. We had been in the house for about a week. As I was bending over a box to grab something, I sensed something coming up on my right. I'm alone in the house. I straighten up and look and see a black, solid-looking ball floating in midair moving towards me. It's the size of a cannonball and looks as solid as that. I move back so it won't touch me as it floats by. It goes straight down the long hallway, into the end bedroom, and disappears right out of the wall toward the front yard. What the hell? I convince myself that I must be tired. So I stop unpacking and go outside to sit down and catch my breath. I never mention it to anyone, figuring I must have imagined it. A few nights later, I'm brushing my teeth in the bathroom. My husband is in bed reading. I hear him say, "What the foo?" I dash in there, and he tells me that he just saw a black ball floating midair. It follows the same path I saw and goes right out the wall like it did before. We both just look at each other and don't say a word. We don't want to give any power or fear to anything. That was the first thing that happened in that house. So many weird moments there. So, I don't really remember too much of this, as I was very young, but my parents filled me in with a fair amount of details semi-recently. I was probably about 4 or so at the time, at my old house with a play kitchen in my room. Completely unpowered, with a simple plastic microwave. All of a sudden, the microwave began to heat up, and I saw a figure with physical features I can't quite remember, but it appeared to be an older woman. I ran downstairs crying, "Mommy! Witch, burn, scare me!" Or something along the lines of that. I brought my moms upstairs and pointed at the witch in my closet, attempting to describe what they looked like. My stepmom said I described something pretty close to her grandmother, although I can't quite remember what features gave that away. That was my personal experience, but my moms have recounted countless others. Here are a few. My stepmom told me about a time when my mom and I were out running errands while she was cooking dinner for the night. What's strange is when she went to the restroom, she came back to her ingredients and utensils scattered in different places in the kitchen. Next, a bit of a creepier one. My moms would be sound asleep at night and then hear loud noises coming from my bedroom, like thumping or crashing. Then, they would come up to my room and see me completely sound asleep in my bed. Other miscellaneous occurrence, I had one of those metal word walls, where you could arrange words into sentences and such. Obviously, I could barely read, and I didn't really touch the wall, but my moms noticed that words on the wall were arranged to say messy room, which could have been nothing but a little weird. That's all I can remember really, I'd have to ask them about more. But yeah, I've been a bit of a believer in spirits or something of the sort after that. I had trouble believing in ghosts, especially since I'm more of a logical explanation type of person. But that changed because of these weird occurrences. Some backstory, my stepdad and mom got married and rented out this big house, perfect for 3 daughters, 1 son, and a dog to live in. My older stepsister and I shared this big room together while my younger siblings got their own room. The first few months were fine, but once we got settled completely, things started acting weird. I remember waking up to my older stepsister whispering to me to wake up. As I'm about to ask her what's wrong, it was like the whole room shook, but mostly her bed. At first I thought she was shaking it, but I look at her, and she has this absolute look of terror and jumps to my bed. We look over and hear knocks and scratches coming from her bed. I immediately think, it's an animal. I tell her I'll look under it and catch it and stuff, all the while freaking out on the inside. I look under the bed, nothing. Look behind the bed, nothing. At this point, the room was quiet. Looked at the walls and tried to press my ears against it. I tell her it's probably a squirrel or a possum that's stuck in the wall. But the thing I couldn't comprehend was how an animal could knock so well and loudly while scratching. We try and go back to bed, but it comes back with a vengeance. Super loud and so much happening. I tell my stepsister that we're getting our dad. It's super late, and he's mad. He comes over into our room, and it's absolutely silent. No noise except for our panic breathing. He looks under the bed and sees nothing. He says to never bother him again unless we have a physical thing attacking us. We both reluctantly go back to bed, trying to ignore the occasional scratch and shake of the room. This continues to happen for the next few years. At that point, I realize it wasn't an animal because there was no way it could have survived that long in the wall without food or water. Also, the fact it was making loud knocks and shaking the bed vigorously made it seem impossible for it to be a living animal. One night a few months after the bed stuff started, the TV we had in the room turned on by itself. It was at full volume and was blaring static. I remember my stepsister bolting upright and her yelling at me to turn it off. The remote wouldn't work, so I had to run up and turn it off manually. Then, we went back to sleep. The next morning, we both realized what happened and thought how weird it was as. I turned on the TV with the remote that wasn't working before, and the TV was on an episode of Friends with the volume at a normal number. The next few years, all my siblings had weird stuff going on in their respective rooms. They have their own stories, and I have mine. My older stepsister started getting these nightmares about the room, my younger brother's door would get opened and closed hard, and my younger sister just felt something touching her. We all tried to tell our parents about the weird stuff going on, and they didn't believe us at all. I was especially hurt because they know how logically inclined I am, but they still didn't believe me. We gave up after a whole 2 years of trying. This was when I realized that I needed to bless the room. I didn't think it would work, but my sister and I were losing sleep and were getting downright irritated. Surprisingly, it worked, and the scratching, knocking, and shaking stopped after almost 3 years of dealing with it. Here is some other silly stuff that happened. 3. My bra got thrown off the counter when I was about to take a shower. I was just annoyed and told the thing to stop throwing my stuff. 4. I heard a box in my closet get knocked down very hard. I just walked out of the room because I just didn't want to deal with it. 5. One time my friend and I were chilling, and we heard knocking on random parts of the house. I tell the spirit or whatever to knock it off, and it stops. My friend freaks out, but I tell them it's fine and to ignore it. 6. This incident occurred in the fall of 2020. My stepdad was working from home in his office space when he saw a white figure walk in the room, look around, and then walk out. My stepdad freaked out and grabbed his gun to search the house. He discovered nothing unusual. He immediately texted me saying that he saw something and that he thinks it might have been a ghost. I told him that yeah, it's okay, and it won't hurt him. After dealing with ghosts for over 6 to 7 years, I wasn't afraid of them and knew how they worked. He went on to apologize for not believing me and how he thought I was just a kid with a vibrant imagination. So, those are my experiences. My family rented an old house in Wisconsin that used to be a schoolhouse. This was during my 7th and half of 8th grade year. During the walkthrough tour of the place, the owner pointed at a door in a basement bedroom and casually said, "Oh, and there is the poltergeist room." Now, my family had previous experiences at multiple houses, so my dad asks for immediate clarification. The owner opens the door, revealing an old underground cellar filled with shelves for canning and pickling jars, among other items. He claims that on their first night in the house, they heard noises coming from the closet. They assumed raccoons or other animals had been in the house, as it had been vacant for a bit before they had moved in. But they swore that was the only time that it happened, and they just jokingly referred to it as the poltergeist room. Parents end up taking the place and take that room as theirs. As we have no plans for the poltergeist room, and maybe because they were creeped out in general, they put my mom's giant dresser and mirror combo in front of the door, completely covering it. Fast forward about a year. Dad has a trucking job and is out of the house. Mom has an early factory job about 30 minutes away and leaves between 4 and 4:30 every morning. My older brother, his wife, and their young daughter are visiting from Michigan. The couple has my other brother's room. He's in my room with me, and Sarah, my niece, sleeps with my mom since my dad is on the road. Mom wakes me up just before she leaves and asks me to go downstairs and sleep with Sarah so she's not alone. I stumble down, half asleep, and pass right out. Next thing I know, Sarah is shaking me awake and telling me she had a terrible dream. I mumble something like, "Oh yeah, what about it?" She says, "The boogeyman was trying to get me. He came from that door over there," and points right at where the door to the poltergeist room is, still completely hidden behind my mom's dresser. Needless to say, I picked her up and got the hell out of that room. We went back to my room, where my brother was still asleep, and crashed in there with Sarah in the middle. It was one of the most unsettling experiences of my life. When I was 9, I slept in the living room. I always kept the light on due to my fear of the dark, because when I was younger I developed an irrational fear of the man. I don't really know how it all started. When I was 4, my mom says I used to talk alone in the dark all the time. I wouldn't even be able to sleep if it wasn't pitch black. Anyway, one afternoon when I was 4, I came out of my room and asked my mom, "Why can't I speak to the angels anymore?" Which is weird because I don't really understand where that was even coming from. It felt weird when it was coming out of my mouth, sort of like I didn't even have any control and I was just watching myself walk out to her just to tell her that. All I really remember is feeling uncomfortable and walking away when she asked me what I meant. Following that, I was immediately terrified of the dark for no apparent reason, and I have vivid memories where I began thinking about the man and fearing him in the dark, but a part of me always thought, "What man?" And I couldn't seem to grasp where any of these ideas were really coming from, and it had been like that for as long as I can remember. I know it doesn't make any sense, but bear with me. Fast forward 5 years, and I'm 9. One day I was just feeling off. I can't really explain how I felt, so I kept it to myself. I suppose it was this blah feeling, if anything. But not like sadness or depression. Just a dullness in general. I secluded myself and didn't really feel like being social. My usual temperament was even subdued, and I mostly just kept to myself. I wasn't tired, but at the same time, I acted as if I were. Anyway, I came home from school feeling unwell, so I went straight to sleep. I was so out of it I even forgot my blanket. I just lay on the couch and passed out. The next thing I knew, I suddenly woke up. It was dark, really dark. I had a blanket, my mom must have brought it out sometime during the afternoon. I usually left the hallway light on, but since I went to sleep early, I never had a chance to. When I woke up, my head was hanging over the armrest facing into the hallway as well. I didn't like to hang my arms over the edge and usually kept myself tucked in, but for some reason, I didn't really react. I was sort of confused because I had suddenly awoken out of a deep sleep, but I was wide awake. In fact, it felt as if I hadn't even been sleeping. I was just alert, and I wasn't a morning person. It usually took me 15 minutes and the bus ride to school before I could even keep my eyes open, so this was weird. So I was lying there in the darkness, by myself, and I just couldn't put my finger on something. Anyway, my mind was sharp, but at the same time I was calm. For some reason I decided to stay on the couch and try to fall back asleep in spite of being terrified of the dark. This was around the time I was actively taking strides in areas to improve, such as overcoming my apprehension of the darkness or being more socially confident. So there I was when I was about to fall asleep when something startled me. Someone was tapping the back of my head. Now as soon as I opened my eyes, I jolted in fear, but only slightly. The tapping stopped in that instant, so for a moment I thought I was imagining things. I was too afraid to look behind me, but after a moment I convinced myself that I was just imagining things, so I began to fall back asleep. But just as I decided I was going to ignore it, the tapping repeated. It was identical to before, and I even sat there and paid close attention to the tapping being done on the back of my forehead. I wasn't imagining things, and I was deeply perturbed. I could barely muster up the courage to move my body, but the moment I realized, this feels very real. It really feels like someone is tapping the back of my head, I jolted my body again, less slightly than before. This time it was something I just couldn't ignore. I knew someone was behind me, and I was apprehensive to see who. Or what it could be. Though a part of me was leaning towards one of my siblings, it didn't make any sense because they never did anything like this. So I began to sit up slowly on the couch with my blanket wrapped around me, and I looked into the hallway. It was dark, but it was still light enough to see where everything was, and a man was standing at the end of the hallway. For some reason he felt familiar, and in that instant several consecutive flashbacks occurred. The fear of the dark. The man. My angels? But then all I could do was focus on his facial expression. He stood there with an unsettling look on his face and began walking towards me. Even though the man looked very real, something about it felt unnatural. At the age of 9, my understanding of reality was not completely fixed. In fact, I was a very open-minded individual. People often said I had a wise soul. My family had never really been religious, we didn't go to church, but we still held on to the concept of God and spirituality. We often shared stories and theorized about possible circumstances, anything to rationalize the supernatural. I didn't know much about God or religion. My knowledge of such topics was narrow. In spite of the knowledge available on TV, I didn't watch a lot of supernatural content, and nobody in the family actively discussed it either. Instead there were callbacks and memories that resonated with me. That moment I asked my mom about the angels was more prominent. No, it wasn't that, it was right before that. I found myself standing in my room, I had suddenly gained awareness, and I was crying. I was standing alone in my room, and without thinking, I asked, "Why do you have to go?" Suddenly thoughts and ideas began to flood into my mind. It was as if something were conveying meaning to me telepathically, and ideas of age, angels, and very general concepts of what that meant came into my mind. That's when the man came up. They told me they would always protect me. Of course, when it felt as if someone had told me that, ideas of something specific they were protecting me from filled my mind, briefly. And then they mentioned something about my future, but then it felt as if it was cut off midway. And suddenly they were gone, and I began to forget. And I panicked, so I ran to my mom and asked her why I couldn't speak to the angels anymore, and she looked at me, and I was filled with fear. It felt as if I shouldn't have said that, and then I went back to my room and I apologized, or at least I imagined that's what I wanted to do, but a part of me felt a strange sense of disappointment. Now snap back to 2009. I began to scream in my head as the guy walked towards me. "Why? Where are you? You said you would always be there. You said you would always protect me. Please, please help." I was frozen in fear, too afraid to speak, but I yelled that in my mind, though I had doubted any kind of response. I really didn't know why I was doing that, or where the idea to specifically ask someone for help in my mind came from. But I thought about how they spoke to me, and despite my confusion, I felt heard. In that short time frame of 10 seconds, the man reached the end of the hallway. Suddenly he stood there and looked straight away from me into the kitchen behind me to my left. He appeared surprised, and for a moment I studied him to make sure it wasn't a trick, that he would lunge towards me when I looked away, and I looked behind me. A woman in a simple white silky dress stood there. She had light hair, brownish/blonde maybe. She stood there with eyes locked on the man, but for some reason I felt a sense of acknowledgement. Like she was telling me, "You're safe." The moment felt like a minute had gone by, but it was much shorter than that. In that instant, as everything had processed in my mind, there was a streak of light and a roaring thunder through the living room, through the hallway, and back into the room he came from. As I pondered, am I really imagining this? The hall light suddenly turned on. I sat there in my couch cocoon of cushioning, and it felt like a heavy weight lifted off of me, and a part of me could breathe again. It was more like a thick fog had suddenly dispersed. In that moment I felt better, and I didn't feel off anymore, but I was still terrified. I sat there for maybe 15 minutes before I built up the courage to turn the TV on. It was 4:16 a.m., and an episode of Wizards of Waverly Place was on. I stayed up for the duration of the night. It was so surreal. I felt that if I were to go to sleep, I would mistake it for a dream, and I didn't want that. I wanted to hold on to it, and I mulled over every moment repeatedly in my mind for roughly 4 hours until my parents woke up. Naturally, when I told my mom, she said, "It was just a dream," but I knew it wasn't a dream. If it were an illusion, it was the most elaborate illusion I have ever witnessed, and I still can't explain how the hall light turned itself on or the feeling I had the day prior. All I know is that I'll never forget it, and I knew my angels were really there, watching over me, but I also knew the man really existed, which terrified me. I know you probably won't believe me, but that's what I saw, and that's what happened. Thanks for listening, and remember, the truth is out there. I was not seen, but rather heard. I was 12 and home alone, in the middle of winter, so dark even though it wasn't late. Dad was gone on a work trip, and Mother took my brothers to appointments and would not be back for several hours. I had been babysitting for 2 years at this point and was a responsible, quiet kid, so I was trusted to be home alone. I was upstairs, reading on my bed when I heard our dining room/kitchen hallway door slam violently. Then again. Then I heard an older male start screaming. Then a younger man started screaming back. My first thought was, weird, Dad came home early and is fighting with an older brother? But I didn't recognize the voices, and the younger male sounded older than my 14-year-old brother. I was instantly terrified, thinking someone broke into the house with a 12-year-old girl home alone. I tiptoed to the window across from my room and saw no vehicles in our driveway and thought maybe I was hearing the neighbors when the same door slammed so hard it shook the whole house. Then the stomping began from the kitchen to the dining room and back. And the screaming got worse. I couldn't really hear what they were arguing about, but it was the most angry, hateful yelling I'd ever heard in my 12 very sheltered years. Something about leaving if he wanted to, and it was his life to live, with replies that he was still living under his, the dad's, roof and will live/act accordingly. I did not go downstairs. There was no phone upstairs, and the staircase came out in the dining room, where our main phone line was, yay 90s, so there was no way in hell I was going downstairs. Plus, even if someone was there, I had a better chance of escape from my window onto the roof. I just waited it out. Went back to my book and ignored it until it stopped. After it had been deathly quiet for a long time, I crept downstairs and looked around. The dining room door was shut, when we always kept it propped open, and it looked like some of the chairs had been moved slightly. The door to the playroom, off the dining room, was also closed when I know we left it open. We always left it open. My mom came home not long after. She checked the house out, and besides the little stuff I found, nothing else was disturbed, so she told me not to worry about it. My brothers teased me for a long time. Until they had their own experiences. My dad even saw a child peek around a door in the house from his office, after all 3 of us were grown and out of the house. It's an old house that is haunted beyond belief. My dad is a shitty human being, and the extreme negative energy fed what was there in my opinion. Especially after my mom died. I was riding my bike with a friend in the trailer park we lived in at the time in this little wooded area right behind it when my friend suddenly fell right off her bike and started yelling at me for pushing her. I'm, obviously, confused about this. I was an anxious kid even back then and was too afraid to even lift one hand off the handles of my bike, much less reach out and push her. So, I tell her she must have just fallen over, because I didn't push her, and we argue about it for a few minutes before heading back to her trailer since it had been decided earlier that day I was spending the night. That night she asked me to look at her back for her, saying it stung and she thought maybe she scraped it up when she fell. When she lifted her shirt up, I could clearly see 2 handprints on her back like someone smacked her as hard as they could. Needless to say, we freaked out a little and didn't go back to that wooded area for a good few months. My family and friends are convinced that a ghost is following me. This story starts many years ago when I was a little girl living in an apartment with my dad and older brother. I used to hate going to bed early and often snuck out of bed to just run around the living room in the middle of the night. I always left the lights off and was able to see because there was enough light shining through the glass door from the balcony. On one such night, I slipped out of bed and made sure my brother was still asleep as we shared a bunk bed and walked as quietly as possible to the living room. I left the bedroom door open every time in case I needed to run back to bed. As I played around the living room, jumping on the couches and the like, I noticed a black shadow from the balcony. I immediately stopped and looked outside and just saw this silhouette-like black figure just standing by the edge of the door near the handle. I freaked out and immediately ran back to bed and closed the door. This woke my brother up and he got worried and asked what was wrong. I told him what I'd seen, and he said he'd go look himself to make sure everything was alright. He opened the door and I watched him walk out. A minute later he came back in and said he didn't see anything, so it must be okay now. I accepted the answer and went back to bed. Later I realized that my brother had still left the door open. I crawled out of bed to close it myself, and before I could touch the door, it slammed shut loudly. This caught my brother's attention, and when I explained what happened, he was confused. I was so terrified that I asked to sleep with him, and he let me. A minute later, though, our dad came into the room and asked what the noise was. I explained to him what I'd seen, and he didn't really believe me, as he doesn't believe at all in the paranormal. He figured one of us had slammed the door. My brother tried to say it was a draft to just get him to go back to bed, but my dad didn't think so since he left the windows and balcony locked and the air off. So my dad goes about trying to question us to see who slammed the door, and in the middle of me trying to explain that I was really only trying to close the door but never touched, we hear a loud noise coming from the living room. It sounded like another door slamming shut. My dad automatically leaves toward the living room and turns on the light. My brother and I followed and saw our dad looking around. We only have 2 doors in the living room, the front door and the balcony door. My dad checks the front door first and finds it locked. Then he goes to the balcony door and finds it unlocked and slightly ajar. See, when that door gets slammed, it's loose enough that it actually slides back a bit. My dad closed and locked the door and sent my brother and me back to bed, and that was the end of that. For a few more years we lived in that apartment, and every now and then I'd see that black figure and hear a door slam, and sometimes the pillows on the couches were on the floor. My dad always thought of a logical answer, and my brother and I started to ignore him since he was. We moved out once my dad got remarried to my stepmom and lived in a 2-story house. My brother and I figured new house, new story. We ended up getting a dog and 2 cats. For a little while it was normal until my stepmom asked me one morning if I had folded the dog's blanket. I said no and told her I hadn't even touched it. She accepted my answer and then asked my brother. He said no as well and asked what this was about. She replied that she had found the blanket perfectly folded and on top of the washing machine. This was incredibly odd, as the dog slept in her bed on the floor and hated her blanket being taken away. We only ever touched it to wash it, and it had just recently been cleaned. Well, our stepmom was very quick to believe it the work of a ghost. She explained to me that she had seen ghosts before when she was younger. My dad, however, remained adamant that ghosts just weren't real and said one of us had probably folded it and forgot about it. We moved on with our day, but that was only the beginning. I started to see the same black figure again, and it was always by an open door right next to the handle. I started getting frightened because I had started sleeping with my door open so the cats could get in whenever they wanted. I tried to ignore it and just sleep, but whenever I heard my door creak, I was terrified to look and always waited until I felt my cats on my bed before I'd look. One night I was staying up late to do homework, and I heard my door creak, so I turned right away, not really thinking and just wanting to see my cat for a break. Instead I saw that black figure, and my heart stopped. I was just frozen. After what couldn't have been more than 10 seconds, the door just slammed shut, and I screamed. My stepmom and dad came running in to see what was wrong, and I frantically told them what I'd seen. My dad just thought I was worn out and seeing things, but my stepmom listened and told me to just wait and she'd be right back. When she came back, it was with her rosary, and she hung it on my door handle, telling me it would keep what I saw away and that if I saw it again, I should go straight to her. It was after this incident that I started having things happen at my mother's house. Every day like clockwork, you'd start hearing these creaking sounds from the ceiling after 6 p.m. and until 3 a.m. My mother and her husband brushed it off as the house settling or the pipes, but my brother and I both agreed that it was just too weird for it to be in a time frame. After that I started getting woken up by my Rottweiler growling at my wall by my bed. I didn't think anything of it at first because he tended to bark and growl out of windows a lot, but when I realized that he was actually growling at my wall, I got nervous. I'd slowly crawl out of my bed and go to hug my dog. He'd pause his growling to sniff me and look me over, and once he was satisfied, he'd go back to growling at the wall. After a few minutes he'd stop and then sniff me again before sitting down. I'd get back in bed, and he'd put his head by my pillow until I fell asleep. When my mother's second dog, a Weimaraner, got old enough, she'd come into my room at night as well and start growling at the wall too. She was the kind of dog who'd make noises and kind of talk to you, but she never growled or barked. I did the same thing and got out of bed until they stopped growling, but it started affecting my sleep. I eventually told my stepmom what was going on after a picture frame above my bed flew onto the floor and crashed. She told me that there was a spirit or ghost that was following me and that I needed to be careful since she believed it was only getting more active. Hearing those words scared me. I managed to push on and try to ignore the doors closing randomly and my dogs growling. Even my cat started getting weird around the house sometimes, but I just kept thinking if I ignored it, it'd go away, but I was wrong. My dad eventually moved houses again, and this time we were living in a brand new home, so knew that my dad had bought it while it was still being built. I explained my worries to my stepmom about the thing following me here, and she told me to just let her know the moment I saw it again. After a few weeks everything was fine until I started hearing voices. The kind that sounds like someone is having a conversation, but it's muffled like they're a few rooms away. I'd stop whatever I was doing to go check it out, but whenever I did, it would stop. It got to the point where I'd be completely alone in the house, and I'd hear what sounds like my dad talking to someone. I'd call out for him confused only to look out a window and see that his car was still gone. After that I started hearing footsteps like someone was walking around in my parents' room upstairs. The weirdest thing about it, though, was it always sounded exactly like my dad's footsteps. Everyone had a specific way of walking, and his was always more thudded and loud. I brought it up to my stepmom, and she told me she heard it too. She then explained to me it was coming from her closet and that sometimes she'd walk in to find the boxes from the top shelf right in the middle of the floor. Keep in mind this is one of those big walk-in closets, so anything that falls wouldn't naturally end up in the center of the floor. I still live with my dad and stepmom to this day while going to college, and I still hear all of this stuff. I don't see the figure as much anymore, and the doors don't slam as often, but they do still shut, it's just quieter. The thing that made my friends believe I had something following me was because I'd spend the night at their house, and anything I usually experienced started happening whenever I came over. One friend of mine who is terrified of anything paranormal actually refused to sleep at my house and doesn't like me spending the night at hers because she had seen the black figure. It's sort of become a bit of a joke now with them. They'll tease me and say that if you invite me over, you better be prepared for 2 guests instead of 1 or make sure all the doors are shut before sleeping. Some friends are incredibly curious and often like to come over or invite me over just so they can try to see the figure. I honestly don't know what to do about it and don't know if I should do anything. I mean, it's never been hostile towards anything, but it's still unsettling to see it sometimes and have it break some stuff. Nowadays I sleep with my door closed and locked, but sometimes I'll wake up to see it open. Sorry for the long story, but I really don't know what to do, and if anyone has any ideas, I'd be happy to hear them.